Hello everyone, welcome to the Mysterious Stories channel, where you'll discover the most mysterious, scary, and fascinating stories. Make sure to turn up the volume and get ready for a spine-chilling experience you won't forget.
The Vanishing Campers, Episode 1, The Laughter in the Woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze, the distant calls of owls, and the crackling of the campfire. A group of 5 friends, Emma, Jake, Mia, Lucas, and Sarah, sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing ghost stories. The campsite was miles from the nearest town, tucked deep into the wilderness where cell signals faded to nothing. For the group, it was meant to be an escape from the monotony of everyday life. "All right, one more story before bed," Jake announced, grinning as he leaned forward. "This one's about the Laughing Man." Emma groaned. "Seriously, another urban legend?" "No, this one's real," Jake insisted. "They say there's something out here in these woods. It laughs to lure people away from their campsites, and when they follow the sound." He paused dramatically. "They're never seen again." Lucas threw a marshmallow at Jake. "You're such a dork." "Hey, I'm just saying, don't wander off if you hear laughter. Unless you want to end up like all the others." Jake's grin widened, but the tension around the campfire was palpable. As the fire burned lower, the group settled into their tents, their laughter fading into the night. The forest grew quiet, and the darkness felt heavier, almost suffocating. Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her tent. She couldn't shake the unease Jake's story had planted in her mind. Just as she began to drift off, she heard it. A laugh. It was faint at first, almost like a distant echo. But it grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the carefree laughter of her friends. It was high-pitched and distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Emma sat up, her heart pounding. She unzipped her tent just enough to peek outside. The campfire's embers still glowed faintly, but everything else was shrouded in darkness. "Did anyone else hear that?" she whispered. No response. Gathering her courage, Emma stepped out of her tent. The laughter came again, this time from deeper in the woods. It sounded playful, almost taunting. Against her better judgment, she grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the sound. The forest seemed to close in around her as she moved further from the campsite. The laughter grew louder, echoing from all directions. She turned her flashlight in a frantic arc, the beam slicing through the darkness but revealing nothing. The air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. "Hello," Emma called out, her voice trembling. "Is someone there?" The laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. Emma's pulse thundered in her ears as she turned to head back to the campsite. But when she looked around, she realized she was lost. The trees all looked the same, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. "Guys," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Jake, Mia, anyone." A rustling sound came from behind her. She spun around, her flashlight flickering. In the beam's dim light, she thought she saw a shadow dart between the trees. Panic set in as she started to run, tripping over roots and stumbling through the underbrush. The laughter returned, louder and more menacing, as if it were chasing her. When Emma finally broke through the trees and into the clearing, the campsite was empty. The tents were still there, but her friends were gone. The campfire had been extinguished, leaving only cold ashes behind. "No," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be happening." The laughter erupted again, surrounding her, filling her ears until she dropped the flashlight and covered her head. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The forest was silent once more. Emma's flashlight flickered out, leaving her in total darkness. The Vanishing Campers, Episode 2, Into the Void. Morning came, but the forest was shrouded in an unnatural gray fog that seemed to muffle all sound. Emma sat by the cold ashes of the campfire, clutching her knees to her chest. She hadn't slept. The absence of her friends was a gaping hole that gnawed at her mind. Their tents were untouched, their belongings scattered as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Desperate for answers, Emma searched the campsite for any clue. Jake's flashlight lay near his tent, its batteries drained. Sarah's scarf was snagged on a low-hanging branch, damp with dew. But the most chilling discovery was a series of footprints leading into the forest, deep impressions in the dirt. too large to belong to any of her friends. I have to find them, Emma whispered to herself, steeling her resolve. She packed a few essentials into her backpack, a map, a compass, and a small hunting knife Jake had insisted on bringing. With trembling hands, she stepped into the forest, following the strange footprints. The laughter began again as she ventured deeper. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the rustling leaves, but it grew louder with each step. Emma gripped the knife tightly, her knuckles white. The footprints led her to a clearing where the trees seemed unnaturally bent, their branches arching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the light. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. At first, Emma thought it was one of her friends, but as she stepped closer, she realized it wasn't human. The figure was tall and thin, its body draped in shadows that shifted like smoke. Its face was obscured, but its head tilted as if observing her. The laughter seemed to emanate from all around, yet the figure remained silent. "Where are they?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. "What did you do to them?" The figure raised an elongated hand, pointing toward a narrow path that snaked deeper into the forest. The laughter grew deafening, and Emma's vision blurred. She blinked, and the figure was gone. Driven by desperation, Emma followed the path. The forest grew darker, the trees more twisted and unnatural. The air was thick and heavy, making each breath a struggle. She stumbled upon a clearing where the ground was littered with objects, a shoe, a water bottle, a torn piece of fabric, all belonged to her friends. "Jake, Mia, Lucas, Sarah," Emma called out, her voice cracking. A faint voice answered, barely audible over the oppressive silence. "Emma." She spun around, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. In the distance, she saw a figure hunched against a tree. It was Mia, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "Mia." Emma ran to her friend, dropping to her knees. "What happened? Where are the others?" Mia's lips trembled as she tried to speak. "It's watching us. It won't let us leave." "What is?" Emma asked, her voice urgent. "The thing in the clearing." Before Mia could answer, the laughter erupted again, this time closer than ever. The shadows around them seemed to ripple and move, closing in. Mia clutched Emma's arm, her grip like iron. "We have to run," Mia whispered. "It's coming." Emma helped Mia to her feet, and the two stumbled back onto the path. The laughter pursued them, echoing through the trees. Emma's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, she saw something in the periphery of her vision, a tall, shadowy figure gliding effortlessly between the trees. They burst into another clearing, gasping for breath, but this one was different. The ground was covered in symbols carved into the dirt, glowing faintly with an eerie light. At the center stood a large stone monolith, its surface etched with ancient runes. "What is this place?" Emma murmured, her voice filled with dread. "A trap," Mia said, her voice hollow. She pointed to the base of the monolith, where Lucas and Sarah lay unconscious. Jake was nowhere to be seen. Before Emma could move, the laughter returned, louder and more distorted. The shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, its form towering over the monolith. It extended its hand, and the runes on the stone flared to life. Emma stood her ground, gripping the knife tightly. "Let them go," she shouted. The figure's laughter stopped, and for a moment, the forest was silent. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, it spoke. "You have entered my domain. To leave, you must play my game." The Vanishing Campers, Episode 3. The Game of Shadows. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the towering shadow loomed before her. Its voice was a chorus of whispers and echoes, chilling her to the core. "The game begins," it intoned. "Survive until the dawn, and they will be free. Fail, and you will all remain here, forever." The glowing runes on the monolith pulsed, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble. Without warning, the shadowy figure disappeared, leaving Emma and Mia in oppressive silence. Lucas and Sarah remained unconscious by the monolith, their shallow breathing the only sign of life. Emma turned to Mia, her voice firm. "We'll get through this. Stay close." Mia nodded weakly, clutching her side. The two began searching for anything that could help. Emma's flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the symbols etched into the ground. The forest felt alive, the trees seeming to shift and writhe as if watching them. The laughter returned, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Emma gripped her knife tightly, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was no longer playful. It was menacing, a cruel mockery that sent shivers down her spine. "This way," Emma urged, pulling Mia toward a narrow path that led away from the monolith. They hadn't gone far when the path split into 3 directions. Each was cloaked in darkness, with no clear indication of where they led. "Which way?" Mia asked, panic rising in her voice. Emma hesitated, scanning the paths. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, trying to focus. The laughter seemed to echo from all directions, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. Finally, she chose the middle path, hoping it would lead them closer to answers. As they moved, the forest seemed to close in tighter around them. The air grew colder and strange. Ghostly lights flickered in the distance. The laughter faded, replaced by whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. "Do you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice trembling. Emma nodded, gripping her knife tighter. The whispers grew louder, forming words that sent chills down her spine. "Turn back. You cannot win. You are ours now." Emma shook her head, pushing forward. The path suddenly opened into another clearing. This one was dominated by a massive, gnarled tree whose roots twisted into unnatural shapes. At its base was a dark opening, a tunnel leading into the earth. "We have to go in," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. Mia hesitated, but the sound of approaching footsteps, heavy, deliberate, propelled her forward. The two climbed down into the tunnel, the air growing damp and stale. The walls were covered in strange, pulsating vines that seemed to hum with energy. At the end of the tunnel, they found another chamber, lit by a faint, otherworldly glow. Jake was there, standing motionless in the center. His eyes were open but vacant, his body stiff as if held by an unseen force. "Jake!" Emma cried, running to him. As she reached out, the laughter returned, louder than ever. The shadowy figure materialized behind Jake, its form even darker and more menacing than before. "You've come far," it said, its voice dripping with malice, "but the game is not over." The figure raised its hand, and the ground began to shake. The vines on the walls writhed, reaching out like tendrils. Emma slashed at them with her knife, cutting a path to Jake. She grabbed his arm, shaking him. "Jake, wake up!" she shouted. His eyes flickered, and he gasped as if coming out of a trance. "Emma, we're getting out of here," she said firmly. The shadow laughed, the sound reverberating through the chamber. "You think it's that easy? You cannot escape me." Emma's resolve hardened. "Watch me." She pulled Jake toward the tunnel entrance, Mia close behind. The vines lashed out, trying to block their path, but Emma's determination was unyielding. She hacked at the vines, her knife flashing in the dim light. As they emerged from the tunnel, the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the trees. The shadow let out an ear-piercing scream, its form dissolving into mist. The oppressive weight lifted from the forest, and the laughter finally ceased. Lucas and Sarah were stirring by the monolith when Emma, Mia, and Jake returned. They helped them to their feet, relief washing over the group as they embraced. "It's over," Emma said, though her voice betrayed her lingering doubt. The group made their way back to the campsite, the morning sun banishing the shadows that had haunted them. But as they packed their belongings and prepared to leave, Emma glanced back at the forest. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a figure among the trees, watching them, and then it was gone. The Watcher, Episode 1, The Shadow in the Garden. It began on an ordinary evening, just after sunset, when the last streaks of daylight faded into a dusky orange. Claire had finished her nightly routine. A cup of tea, a final check of her emails, and a quick look out the kitchen window into her backyard garden. But that night, something was different. Amid the rows of hydrangeas and the old oak tree, a figure stood. Tall and unmoving, it was shrouded in shadow. Claire squinted, thinking it might be a trick of the fading light, but the figure remained. It was too still, too solid to be a shadow cast by the trees. She stepped back from the window, her heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't seem to notice her watching. After several long moments, she mustered the courage to turn on the backyard floodlights. But when the bulbs flickered to life, the garden was empty. The figure had vanished. Claire tried to laugh it off. Just my imagination, she muttered, but the unease lingered. She double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before retreating to her bedroom, yet sleep didn't come easily. All night, her mind replayed the image of the shadowy figure standing among her flowers. The following night, Claire found herself drawn to the window again, her tea forgotten on the counter. The backyard looked peaceful under the silver light of the moon, but her eyes scanned every inch of the garden, and then she saw it again. The figure was back, standing in the same spot as before. Claire's breath caught in her throat. This time, she could make out a faint outline. A tall man, dressed in what looked like a long coat, his face obscured by the darkness. "Who are you?" she whispered, though he couldn't possibly hear her. Her first instinct was to call the police, but when she reached for her phone, the figure tilted its head slightly, as if aware of her intentions. Her fingers froze over the screen. For reasons she couldn't explain, she felt a chilling certainty. He didn't want her to call for help. Instead, Claire grabbed a flashlight and her kitchen knife. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped out onto the back porch. The cool night air prickled her skin, and the sound of crickets seemed unnaturally loud. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. "Whoever you are, you need to leave." "I'll call the police." The figure didn't move. Claire aimed the flashlight toward the garden, but the beam flickered and died, leaving her in darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the light. When it finally came back on, the garden was empty once more. Claire barely slept that night, and when morning came, she surveyed the garden in daylight. Everything seemed normal. There were no footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. She told herself it had to be stress or exhaustion, but the memory of the figure's unblinking presence refused to fade. That evening, Claire invited her friend Alex over. "I swear I'm not crazy," she said, recounting the events of the past 2 nights. Alex, ever the skeptic, chuckled. "It's probably just a neighbor cutting through your yard," Alex said. "Or maybe a stray animal." "You're working too hard, Claire." Still, Alex agreed to stay the night. Together, they set up a camera facing the garden and waited. Hours passed in tense silence. The 2 friends huddled on the couch with the TV muted. Midnight came and went, and Claire began to relax. "See," Alex said with a yawn, "nothing out there." But just as the words left her mouth, the camera feed glitched. Static filled the screen for a moment before the image returned, and there he was. The figure stood in the same spot, as motionless as ever. Claire and Alex froze, their eyes locked on the screen. "What the hell?" Alex muttered. Claire bolted for the window, pulling the curtains aside. The garden was empty again. She turned back to the TV, but the figure was still there on the screen, staring directly into the camera. The Watcher, Episode 2, The Silent Stare. The next morning, Alex was uncharacteristically quiet. The camera footage had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She insisted on staying with Claire another night, determined to uncover the truth about the mysterious figure. "Maybe it's some kind of prank," Alex suggested over breakfast. "A weirdo with too much time on his hands." Claire nodded, though she wasn't convinced. The figure's presence had felt wrong, not like a prank or a trespasser, but something darker, something unnatural. But to spend the day preparing, they installed more cameras around the yard, checked the locks on every door and window, and even borrowed a motion sensor light from a neighbor. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a heavy sense of dread settled over the house. By 10 p.m., Claire and Alex were back on the couch, their eyes glued to the monitors displaying live feeds from the cameras. The garden was bathed in the harsh glow of the motion sensor light, and for hours, nothing happened. "Maybe he won't show up tonight," Alex said, stifling a yawn. But Claire couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Her gaze darted to the window, where the curtains were tightly drawn. She thought she heard something, a faint rustling, like footsteps on grass, but when she turned up the volume on the monitors, the night was silent. At midnight, the motion sensor light flickered. Both women sat upright, their hearts pounding. The cameras showed nothing unusual, but the light continued to blink erratically, as if struggling against an unseen force. Then, on the screen displaying the backyard feed, the figure appeared. He stood in the same spot as before, his outline sharp against the pale light of the moon. This time, Claire noticed something she hadn't before. His head was slightly tilted, as if observing them. "Oh my God," Alex whispered. "He's back." Claire's chest tightened. "Turn on the floodlights," she said, her voice trembling. Alex fumbled with the remote, and the backyard was suddenly bathed in bright, artificial light. But just like the night before, the figure was gone. They rewound the footage, but the moment the floodlights came on, the cameras glitched static, overtaking the screen for several seconds before returning to normal. "We need to call someone," Alex said, pacing the living room. "The police, a security company, anyone." "This isn't normal." Claire hesitated. "What are we going to tell them? That a shadowy figure keeps appearing in my garden and vanishing into thin air. They'll think we're crazy." Alex opened her mouth to argue, but a loud thud interrupted her. It came from the back door. Both women froze, their eyes wide. "Did you lock it?" Alex asked, her voice barely a whisper. Claire nodded, but the fear in her eyes betrayed her doubt. Slowly, she grabbed the knife from the counter and motioned for Alex to stay behind her. The thud came again, this time louder, as if something heavy was pressing against the door. "Who's there?" Claire called, trying to keep her voice steady. There was no response, only the oppressive silence of the night. Gathering her courage, Claire approached the door. She peered through the peephole, but saw nothing. Her hand hovered over the lock, but before she could turn it, the motion sensor light outside blinked back on. Alex, still watching the monitors, gasped. "Claire, he's at the back gate." Claire whipped around to the screen. The figure was there, closer than ever, standing just beyond the wooden gate that led into the garden. He was facing the camera now, his features still obscured, but there was something deliberate about his stance. He wasn't just standing, he was waiting. "What does he want?" Alex asked, her voice breaking. Claire shook her head, a cold knot of fear tightening in her stomach. "I don't know." Suddenly, the figure moved. Slowly, he reached up and placed his hand on the gate. The wood creaked under his touch, the sound loud and jarring through the speakers. And then, as if sensing their eyes on him, he looked directly into the camera. The screen glitched, static filling every monitor. When the feed returned, the garden was empty again. Neither Claire nor Alex slept that night. They sat together on the couch, jumping at every creak and groan the house made. By dawn, the tension was almost unbearable. As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Claire ventured outside. The garden was eerily quiet, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. She approached the gate where the figure had stood and found something chilling, a single handprint pressed into the wood, larger than any human hand she had ever seen. The Watcher, Episode 3, The Final Glimpse. The days following the discovery of the handprint passed in a haze of fear and paranoia. Claire and Alex tried to continue with their lives, but the figure's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud. The cameras were useless, the police dismissed their story as overactive imaginations, and the handprint had faded by the next morning as if it had never been there. "We need to leave," Alex insisted one evening. "Just pack up and go. This isn't worth it, Claire." Claire wanted to agree, but something rooted her to the house. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity, a desperate need to understand what was happening and why the figure had chosen her garden. "Just one more night," Claire said. "If we don't see anything, we'll leave tomorrow." "I promise." Reluctantly, Alex agreed. They spent the evening preparing once more. The cameras were checked, the motion sensor light repositioned, and this time, Claire brought out her father's old hunting rifle. They settled in, waiting for the inevitable. Midnight came and went without incident. The monitors showed only the stillness of the garden, and Claire began to wonder if it was truly over. Alex had dozed off on the couch, her head resting on a pillow, but Claire stayed awake, her eyes heavy but unwilling to close. And then, at 3 a.m., the motion sensor light flickered on. Claire's stomach churned as she leaned forward, staring at the monitor. The figure was back, but this time he wasn't standing in the garden. He was on the back porch, mere feet from the door. His face was still hidden in shadow, but Claire could feel his eyes on her through the screen. She grabbed the rifle and shook Alex awake. "He's here," she hissed. Alex bolted upright, her sleepiness replaced by terror. "Call the police," she whispered. Claire hesitated. Her hands trembled as she gripped the rifle, her gaze flickering between the screen and the door. The figure hadn't moved. He just stood there, silent and still, as though waiting for something. "What does he want?" Alex asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," Claire replied, her throat dry. "But I'm going to find out." Before Alex could stop her, Claire unlocked the door and stepped outside, the rifle held tightly in her hands. The cold night air bit at her skin, and the world seemed unnaturally quiet. She raised the gun, aiming it at the figure. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed toward the garden. Claire's heart raced as she glanced in the direction he indicated. At first, she saw nothing. But then, among the flowers and shrubs, she noticed something strange, a small, rectangular stone jutting out of the ground, partially covered by dirt and moss. Alex joined Claire in the garden moments later, flashlight in hand. Together, "What is that?" Claire asked, but when she turned back, the figure was gone. Uncovered the stone, revealing an old, weathered gravestone. The inscription was barely legible, but they could make out a name, Margaret Layton, and the dates carved into the stone suggested she had died over a century ago. "Why is this here?" Alex asked, her voice trembling. Claire shook her head, a chill running down her spine. "I don't know. I didn't even know this house had a history like that." Suddenly, the motion sensor light flickered again, and both women spun around. The figure was back, standing at the edge of the garden. For the first time, he moved toward them, slow and deliberate. Claire raised the rifle, but something in her heart told her it wouldn't help. "What do you want?" Claire asked again, tears streaming down her face. The figure stopped a few feet away, slowly. He raised his hand once more and pointed at the gravestone. Claire and Alex exchanged a terrified glance but understood. Somehow, the figure wanted them to acknowledge the grave, to understand its significance. "Margaret," Claire whispered, kneeling by the stone. "I'm sorry. I didn't know." As her words hung in the air, the figure began to fade. His outline blurred, dissolving into the night like smoke in the wind. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving behind only the faint echo of his presence. The next morning, Claire contacted a local historian to learn more about Margaret Layton. She discovered that Margaret had been the original owner of the property and had died tragically in a fire that destroyed the house over 100 years ago. Her grave had been forgotten when the land was rebuilt, and it seemed the figure had been watching over her resting place, waiting for someone to acknowledge her. Claire and Alex decided to restore the grave and plant flowers around it as a tribute. From that day on, the figure never returned. But every night, as Claire looked out into the garden, she couldn't help but feel a quiet, watchful presence, not one of malice, but of peace. The Black Door, Episode 1, The Knock. The black door had always been there, a silent anomaly in Emma's otherwise ordinary apartment. It sat at the end of the hallway, its surface matte and unremarkable except for the heavy iron handle and a keyhole that seemed to swallow light. When Emma first moved in, she assumed it was a utility closet, but when she tried the handle, it wouldn't budge. Her landlord had waved off her questions, mumbling something about structural quirks and safety regulations. Over time, Emma learned to ignore it. Months passed, and the door became part of the background, a mystery she didn't have the energy to solve. But everything changed on a rainy Thursday night. Emma was curled up on her couch, the drumming of rain against the windows lulling her into a state of half-sleep. The TV flickered with the muted images of an old black and white movie. That's when she heard it, a soft, deliberate knock. She sat up, her heart skipping. The sound had come from the hallway, from the black door. Emma froze, her eyes darting toward the shadowed hallway. The knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, she stood and approached the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. When she reached the door, she pressed her ear against the cold wood. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no response, just silence, deep and oppressive. She lingered there, her hand hovering over the handle. Logic told her it was impossible. The door led to nowhere. But her gut churned with unease. Summoning her courage, she knocked back. The response was immediate. 3 sharp knocks, so forceful that the vibration seemed to echo in her chest. Emma stumbled back, her pulse racing. She grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, Sarah. You're hearing knocks from a door that doesn't open. Sarah's skepticism was clear even over the phone. I'm not imagining it, Emma insisted. Can you come over? Emma, it's probably just the rain. Pipes or something. Don't freak yourself out. Please, Emma pleaded. Sarah sighed. Fine. I'll be there in 20 minutes. While waiting, Emma sat on the floor of the hallway, staring at the door. The rain outside had intensified, the sound merging with the rhythmic ticking of her wall clock. But the knocking didn't return. When Sarah finally arrived, her presence brought a sense of relief. All right, show me this spooky door, Sarah said, half joking. Emma led her to the hallway. It's this one, the black door. Sarah frowned, inspecting it. It's just a door, probably locked for a reason. She rattled the handle. It didn't move. I'm telling you, it knocked back, Emma said, her voice cracking. All right, let's test it, Sarah said, knocking 3 times on the door. They waited, holding their breaths. Nothing. Sarah smirked. See, nothing too. 3 knocks boomed from the other side, cutting her off. Sarah's face went pale. Okay, that was weird. Emma grabbed her arm. What do we do? Before Sarah could answer, a faint scratching sound began, like nails dragging across the wood. Then, a voice, low, distorted, and barely audible. Let me out. Episode 2, The Key. The voice had been unmistakable, chilling Emma and Sarah to their cores. They bolted from the hallway, slamming the bedroom door behind them. Sarah paced frantically while Emma sat on the bed, clutching a pillow as if it could shield her from whatever was behind the black door. What the hell was that? Sarah whispered, her face pale. Was that a person? How could it be? Emma shook her head. I don't know, but it's been sealed for as long as I've lived here. There's no way anyone could be inside, right? They stared at each other, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Emma's mind raced, recalling the landlord's dismissive explanation about the door. Why had he been so vague? Was he hiding something? The next morning, despite the unease lingering in the apartment, Sarah insisted on investigating further. We need to figure out what's behind that door. If it's a prank, fine. But if it's something else, her voice trailed off. Emma hesitated but eventually agreed. Together, they went to the building manager's office. Mr. Calhoun, an elderly man with thick glasses, looked up from his desk with a frown. Is there something wrong with your apartment? He asked gruffly. It's about the black door, Emma began. In my hallway. What's behind it? Mr. Calhoun's expression darkened. You don't need to worry about that door. It's locked for a reason. But we heard something, Sarah interjected, knocking. A voice. The old man's face went pale, and he leaned back in his chair. You didn't open it, did you? No, Emma said quickly. It's locked. But what's going on? What's behind it? Mr. Calhoun sighed heavily, glancing around as if to make sure no one was listening. That door, it's older than the building. When this place was renovated, the workers found it and built around it. Nobody knows where it leads. But everyone who's tried to open it, well, let's just say bad things happen. Unsatisfied with his vague warnings, Emma and Sarah returned to the apartment. Emma's curiosity burned brighter now, outweighing her fear. She spent the afternoon scouring the internet for anything that could explain the door. Urban legends, architectural anomalies, even stories of cursed objects, but nothing seemed to match. As evening fell, Emma heard a loud thud from the hallway. She and Sarah exchanged nervous glances before stepping out to investigate. Lying on the floor, in front of the black door, was a small, ornate key. Its metal was tarnished, but the intricate design was unmistakable. Where did that come from? Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emma bent down to pick it up, her hand trembling. The key felt cold, unnaturally so, as if it had been pulled from an icy grave. She stared at it, a sense of foreboding washing over her. Do you think it fits the door? Sarah asked. Emma nodded slowly. There's only one way to find out. Against her better judgment, Emma inserted the key into the lock. It slid in effortlessly, the mechanism clicking with an almost eager sound. She hesitated, her hand on the handle, and turned to Sarah. Are you sure about this? Sarah asked, her voice tight with fear. No, Emma admitted, but I can't just ignore it. Taking a deep breath, She turned the handle and pushed the door open. It swung inward with a low creak, revealing nothing but darkness. A cold, damp air wafted out, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell. Emma reached for her phone's flashlight and shined it into the void. The beam of light illuminated a narrow staircase spiraling downward, the walls lined with damp, crumbling bricks. The faint sound of dripping water echoed up to meet them. "This wasn't here before," Emma whispered. "Was it?" Before Sarah could respond, a distant sound echoed from below. A single, resonant knock, then another, and another. Episode 3, What Lies Beneath. Emma and Sarah stared into the dark abyss of the staircase, their hearts pounding in unison. The repeated knocking echoed again, growing louder and more insistent. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was a demand. "We should call someone," Sarah whispered, clutching Emma's arm. "The police, a priest, anyone." "And tell them what?" "That a hidden staircase just appeared in my apartment." Emma's voice was tight. "No one would believe us. We have to see where it goes." Before Sarah could protest, Emma started descending the stairs. Her phone's flashlight cast eerie, flickering shadows on the damp walls. Reluctantly, Sarah followed, her every step hesitant. The air grew colder and heavier the deeper they went, and the metallic scent intensified, mingling with something earthy and rotten. The staircase seemed endless, winding down in tight spirals. Just as Sarah was about to suggest turning back, they reached the bottom. The flashlight illuminated a small, circular chamber with smooth stone walls. In the center of the room was an ancient wooden table, its surface scarred and stained. On it rested a book bound in cracked leather and a tarnished silver bell. Emma approached the table cautiously. The book was covered in strange symbols, its spine brittle with age. She hesitated before opening it. The pages were filled with jagged handwriting in a language she couldn't recognize. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. Emma didn't answer. Her attention was drawn to the bell. It was small, its handle shaped like a serpent coiled around itself. Against her better judgment, she reached out and touched it. The metal was freezing. The knocking returned, this time louder and closer. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. The chamber trembled, dust falling from the ceiling. Emma and Sarah exchanged panicked glances. "We need to leave." "Now," Sarah urged, backing toward the staircase. Before Emma could move, the book's pages began to flutter as if caught in a violent wind. The symbols glowed faintly, casting an otherworldly light. The bell let out a low, resonant chime, though neither of them had rung it. The knocking stopped. Silence enveloped the room, thick and oppressive. Then came the voice. "You have found me." It was deep and guttural, reverberating through the chamber. Emma's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the table to steady herself. Sarah screamed, pressing herself against the wall. From the shadows of the staircase, a figure emerged. It was tall and shrouded in darkness, its form barely distinguishable from the surrounding gloom. Eyes like burning embers locked onto Emma. "Who are you?" Emma managed to whisper. "I am what you sought," the figure replied. "And now, you cannot leave." The chamber seemed to close in on them, the walls pulsating with a life of their own. Emma's mind raced. The book, the bell, they had to mean something. She grabbed the bell and rang it desperately. The figure recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. The voice roared in pain, shaking the chamber. Sarah grabbed Emma's arm, pulling her toward the staircase. "Go!" Sarah screamed. They scrambled up the stairs, the figure's enraged howls chasing them. The air grew warmer as they ascended, the oppressive weight lifting with each step. When they reached the top, Emma slammed the black door shut and turned the key. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They sat on the hallway floor, gasping for breath. The black door now seemed ordinary again, its surface dull and lifeless. "What was that?" Sarah finally asked, her voice shaking. Emma didn't answer. She held the key tightly, her knuckles white. "I don't know. But I'm never opening that door again." They left the apartment that night, unable to stay another minute. Emma handed her keys to the landlord the next morning without explanation. As they drove away, she couldn't help but glance back at the building. The black door watched her go. The Candlelight Ritual, Episode 1, The Invitation. The old notebook was tucked away in the corner of the dusty attic, its cracked leather cover almost hidden beneath a pile of forgotten trinkets. Nora discovered it while cleaning her grandmother's house, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the yellowed pages as she opened it. The scrawled handwriting detailed a game called the Candlelight Ritual. According to the instructions, it was more than a game, it was a test. The rules were simple: light a single candle at the stroke of midnight, set it in the center of a dark room, and invite the guest by reciting a specific phrase. The candle had to remain lit until dawn, and under no circumstances should it be extinguished before sunrise. The text ended with a chilling warning: if the candle goes out, the guest will stay. Nora's curiosity was piqued. She had always been drawn to the supernatural, but she considered herself a skeptic at heart. That night, as the wind howled outside and the old house creaked under the pressure of the storm, she decided to try the ritual. After all, it was just a game. What harm could it do? At 5 minutes to midnight, Nora prepared the room. She chose the dining room, a space surrounded by windows with heavy curtains to block out the moonlight. She placed a single white candle on the table and turned off every light in the house. The darkness was oppressive, broken only by the flickering flame of the candle. As the clock struck 12, Nora recited the phrase written in the notebook: I open this door to the night. Come, be my guest, but tread lightly. Her voice trembled despite herself. For a moment, nothing happened. She let out a nervous laugh, feeling a bit foolish. But then, the air in the room grew colder, and the candle's flame wavered, as though disturbed by an unseen breath. The next hour passed uneventfully, though Nora couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She told herself it was her imagination, a trick of the dark. Yet, the silence seemed heavier, the shadows in the corners darker. Occasionally, she thought she heard faint whispers, but whenever she strained to listen, they stopped. By 2 a.m., the unease had grown into a tangible fear. The candle's flame flickered violently, casting distorted shapes on the walls. Nora glanced at the notebook, flipping through the pages to distract herself. Her heart froze when she noticed a new line scrawled at the bottom of the instructions: do not look behind you. Nora's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't written that. The words were fresh, the ink still glistening. Slowly, she closed the notebook, her hands trembling. The room felt colder than ever, and she was acutely aware of the silence. She couldn't resist. Her eyes darted to the reflection in the dark window. At first, she saw only herself, her pale face illuminated by the candlelight. But then, something shifted in the reflection, a shadow. Tall and thin, it stood just behind her, unmoving. Nora spun around, but the space was empty. The candle flickered wildly, and the whispers returned, louder this time. Words she couldn't understand, a language that made her ears ring. The minutes crawled by, each second feeling like an eternity. Nora clutched the edges of the table, her eyes glued to the candle. She dared not let it go out. Whatever was in the room with her, she knew it was waiting. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the whispers stopped, and the room fell into a suffocating silence. But Nora knew the night was far from over. The guest had arrived, and it wasn't leaving until dawn. Episode 2, The Silent Hours. By 3:15 a.m., Nora's nerves were fraying. The oppressive silence in the room was almost unbearable, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. Her eyes burned from staring at the candle, terrified that even a blink might extinguish the fragile flame. The notebook sat closed on the table, but it seemed to call to her. She resisted the urge to open it again, fearful of what new warning might have appeared. The shadows in the room seemed to pulse, shifting slightly every time the candle flickered. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps echoed through the room, coming from the front door. Nora's heart stopped. She hadn't invited anyone over, and no one should be awake at this hour. She stayed rooted in place, staring at the door through the open archway that led to the hallway. Don't answer it, she whispered to herself, recalling the ominous warning from the notebook. Once the ritual begins, no one may enter or leave. The knocking came again, louder this time. The doorknob rattled as though someone were trying to force it open. Nora clenched her fists, her eyes darting back to the candle. The flame flickered violently, but it held steady. She felt a cold draft brush against her skin, though all the windows were shut. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic scratching. It sounded like fingernails dragging against the wood. Nora's stomach churned as the sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the walls. The candle's light dimmed, its flame shrinking as if struggling to stay alive. Nora grabbed the notebook, clutching it like a talisman. She flipped through the pages, hoping for guidance, but found only more chilling instructions. Do not speak. Do not move. The guest is watching. Her breathing quickened as the scratching grew louder, now accompanied by faint whispers. The language was the same as before, guttural and foreign, making her ears ache. She squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her face. Whatever was happening, she had to endure it until dawn. By 4 a.m., the whispers subsided, leaving an eerie calm. Nora dared to open her eyes. The candle was burning brighter now, its steady flame a small comfort. She glanced around the room, her eyes scanning the shadows. They seemed less menacing, more contained. But then she noticed something on the far wall. A dark, hand-shaped mark was smeared across the wallpaper, its fingers long and claw-like. It hadn't been there before. Nora's pulse quickened as she realized the mark was slowly growing, spreading outward like ink in water. She kept her focus on the candle, whispering a silent prayer. The rules were clear. The flame must not go out. Whatever the guest was, it thrived in darkness. At 4:30 a.m., the house began to groan. The walls shuddered as if under some great weight, and the floor beneath her feet felt unsteady. The handprint on the wall had multiplied, dozens of them now stretching across the room, each one darker and more defined than the last. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent. This time, they formed words she could almost understand. They were calling her name, Nora. She bit her lip to keep from screaming. Her instinct screamed at her to run, to flee the house, but she knew the rules. Leaving would only make things worse. She had to see the ritual through. By 5 a.m., the air grew heavier, pressing down on her like a physical force. The candle's flame wavered but held, its light pushing back against the encroaching darkness. Nora's strength was waning, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She clung to the table for support, her knuckles white. The handprints on the walls began to fade, retreating into the shadows. The whispers grew distant, the oppressive presence in the room lifting slightly. Nora glanced at the clock, willing the minutes to pass faster. Only an hour remained. Stay with me, she murmured to the candle, as if its tiny flame could hear her plea. The house fell silent once more, but Nora knew better than to let her guard down. The darkest hour was yet to come. Episode 3, The Final Hour. By 5:15 a.m., the air in the dining room felt heavier than ever, each breath Nora took coming with effort. Her eyes were locked on the candle, its flame still flickering but miraculously intact. She counted the minutes, every tick of the clock feeling like an eternity. The oppressive silence was broken by a low creak. Nora froze, her gaze darting to the corner of the room. There, where the shadows were deepest, something shifted. A tall, spindly figure stepped forward, its form barely visible against the dim light of the candle. It didn't move closer but stood there, swaying slightly as though it were studying her. Its head tilted, and Nora's skin crawled. She dared not look away from the candle, knowing the rules, but she could feel its presence like icy needles pressing against her skin. "You invited me," the figure whispered, its voice a raspy hiss that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "And yet you cower. Is this not what you wanted?" Nora's hands gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She couldn't answer. The notebook's warnings echoed in her mind. Do not speak. Do not move. The guest is watching. The figure let out a low, guttural chuckle. So silent, so obedient. But will you last? The candle's flame flickered violently, shrinking for a moment before steadying. Nora's heart raced as the figure took a slow, deliberate step closer. It remained at the edge of the candlelight, its features obscured, but she could make out long, claw-like fingers and a face that seemed both human and inhuman at once. The clock struck 5:30 a.m. The figure stopped moving, its head snapping toward the sound. It let out a low growl, the sound vibrating through the room. The handprints on the walls began to reappear, darker and more numerous than before, creeping toward the candle as though drawn to its light. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, whispering a silent plea for the dawn to come faster. The figure's presence was unbearable, its gaze like a physical weight pressing down on her. "It's almost time," the figure hissed, "but will you make it?" The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic, filling the room with a cacophony of unintelligible voices. Nora's head pounded, her vision blurring. She fought the urge to scream, clinging to the one rule that mattered most: the candle must not go out. At 5:45 a.m., the figure began to retreat, its form melting back into the shadows. But the whispers grew louder, the handprints creeping ever closer to the candle. The flame wavered, shrinking to a pinprick of light. "Stay with me," Nora begged, her voice barely a whisper. She shielded the flame with her hands, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing closer, the air growing thinner. The clock struck 5:55 a.m. The shadows surged forward, the handprints reaching the edge of the table. The figure reappeared, towering over the candle, its clawed hand outstretched. For a moment, Nora thought it would snuff out the flame. She held her breath, tears streaming down her face as she braced for the end. But the figure hesitated, its hand hovering above the flame. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The first rays of dawn broke through the heavy curtains, spilling golden light into the room. The figure recoiled, letting out an inhuman shriek as the sunlight touched it. The handprints vanished, the shadows retreating to their corners. The candle's flame flared brightly before extinguishing itself, its job done. Nora collapsed to the floor, sobbing with relief. The air in the room felt lighter, the oppressive presence gone. She glanced at the notebook, its pages now blank as though the ritual had erased itself from existence. She didn't dare touch the candle or the notebook again. As the sun rose higher, bathing the house in warm light, Nora made a silent vow. She would never play another game she didn't understand. The night had taken something from her, something she couldn't name, and she knew it would haunt her forever. The Dollhouse, Episode 1, The New Arrival. Claire had always been drawn to antiques, their history and craftsmanship enchanting her in ways modern items never could. So when she stumbled upon the dollhouse at a dusty estate sale, she knew she had to have it. It was an exquisite replica of a Victorian home, complete with intricate moldings and tiny, hand-painted furnishings. But what truly captivated her was how closely it resembled her own house, down to the ivy creeping up the side of the miniature facade. The seller, an elderly woman with clouded eyes, had hesitated before naming her price. "It's a curious piece," she murmured, her voice a rasp. "Keep it safe, and don't let them out." Claire had laughed nervously, brushing off the odd warning. Now, as she carried the dollhouse into her living room, a strange unease settled over her. The air in the house felt heavier, as if the tiny replica had shifted something intangible. That evening, Claire set the dollhouse on a sturdy table in the corner of her living room. She spent hours examining its details, marveling at the craftsmanship. The miniature furniture was perfectly arranged, each room a snapshot of a life once lived. In the tiny parlor, a pair of porcelain dolls sat on a velvet couch. Their painted faces were frozen in expressions of serene contentment. As the hours passed, Claire's initial unease faded, replaced by fascination. She rearranged some of the furniture, aligning it with the layout of her own home. It was uncanny how every detail matched, from the ornate chandelier in the dining room to the tiny clock on the mantelpiece, its hands permanently fixed at 3:15. That night, she awoke to a soft thud. Blinking in the darkness, she strained her ears. Another thud, this time louder. It was coming from the living room. Heart-pounding, Claire crept down the stairs. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She flicked on the light, her gaze immediately falling on the dollhouse. The tiny furniture she'd so carefully arranged earlier was in disarray. The porcelain dolls were no longer seated on the couch. One lay on the floor of the parlor, its delicate arm bent at an impossible angle. The other stood upright, facing the front door of the miniature house. Claire froze. "Did I move them?" she whispered to herself, though she already knew the answer. She rearranged the furniture and placed the dolls back on the couch, their serene expressions now unsettling. Turning off the light, she retreated to her bedroom, convincing herself it had to be her imagination. The next morning, Claire's unease deepened. As she poured her coffee, she glanced at the dollhouse and noticed something chilling. A third doll now stood in the parlor. This one was smaller, its painted features faintly resembling Claire herself. It stood in the exact spot she'd been standing the night before, its tiny porcelain face tilted upward as though watching her. The air seemed to thicken, the room growing colder despite the summer heat. Claire's hand trembled as she reached for the tiny figure, intending to remove it. But as her fingers brushed its surface, a sharp jolt shot through her hand, like static electricity magnified tenfold. She gasped, pulling back, her skin tingling. Her heart raced as she stared at the dollhouse. The miniature clock on the mantelpiece ticked forward, the hands moving for the first time. It stopped at 3:16. Episode 2. The Shifting Shadows. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the dollhouse was watching her. After the incident with the third doll, she resolved to put it out of her mind, chalking it up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination. Yet, as the days passed, the unease grew. On a breezy Tuesday evening, Claire sat on her couch, trying to lose herself in a book. The dollhouse sat in its corner, its pristine facade almost glowing under the dim light of the living room. But every so often, Claire thought she saw movement from the corner of her eye. A flicker, like a shadow shifting within the tiny rooms. Setting her book down, she approached the dollhouse. Everything appeared as she had left it. The furniture was still arranged, the porcelain dolls still seated on the couch in the miniature parlor. The third doll, the one that looked disturbingly like her, stood in the corner of the dining room now, its small face turned toward the dollhouse's front door. Her breath hitched. She hadn't moved it. Claire decided to test her nerves. She rearranged the dolls, placing all three in a neat line on the parlor's couch. Then, taking a deep breath, she snapped a photo with her phone as proof of their positions. Satisfied, she returned to her book, the image lingering on her screen like a talisman. At 11:15 p.m., the sound of faint tapping woke her. The rhythmic knock-knock-knock was so soft that it could have been mistaken for the wind. Claire rubbed her eyes and sat up. The sound was coming from the dollhouse. Heart-pounding, she grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam illuminated the dollhouse, its ornate details casting eerie shadows on the walls. The tapping stopped. She stepped closer, her flashlight revealing something that made her stomach churn. The dolls were no longer on the couch. She checked her phone. The photos she'd taken earlier showed them in their original positions. Yet now, one doll stood in the tiny kitchen, one at the foot of the staircase, and the third, her look-alike, was standing in the parlor, facing the miniature fireplace. The dollhouse clock read 3:17. Claire's hands trembled as she adjusted the dolls once again, placing them back in the parlor and snapping another photo. She tried to laugh it off, telling herself it had to be a trick of her tired mind. Maybe she'd bumped the table. Maybe she'd forgotten moving them herself. But the laughter died when she glanced at the real clock on her wall. It too read 3:17, though she was certain it had been just past midnight when she last checked. Her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen and saw an alert for a new photo in her gallery. Frowning, she opened it. Her heart stopped. The image was of the dollhouse, but it wasn't one she'd taken. The angle was from within the house, as if the camera had been placed inside one of the rooms. The photo showed Claire herself, standing in her living room, staring at the dollhouse with a look of abject terror on her face. She dropped the phone, the sound echoing in the silent room. Slowly, she turned back to the dollhouse. One by one, the tiny lights in its rooms began to flicker on. The parlor, the dining room, the bedroom upstairs, each window glowing with an otherworldly light. And then, the front door of the dollhouse creaked open. Episode 3. The Final Game. Claire stared at the dollhouse, her breath shallow as the tiny front door swung open. The soft, golden light spilling from the miniature windows cast long, eerie shadows across the room. A faint sound emerged from the dollhouse, like the distant echo of footsteps on creaking floorboards. It was coming from inside. For a moment, Claire couldn't move. She felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by an overwhelming sense of dread. Finally, summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped closer to the dollhouse. Her trembling hands hovered over the tiny structure as she peered inside. The three dolls were no longer in the parlor. Instead, they stood in different rooms, one in the upstairs bedroom, one in the dining room, and her look-alike the third doll was now in the foyer, facing the open front door. Her pulse quickened. The miniature clock on the dollhouse mantelpiece ticked forward, its hands stopping at 3:18. The real clock on her wall echoed the motion, its hands synchronized with the one in the dollhouse. Suddenly, the dollhouse's tiny chandelier began to sway, its crystal beads jingling softly. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Claire felt the air in her living room grow colder, and a shiver ran down her spine. "What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The dollhouse gave no answer, but the lights inside flickered in response, as if acknowledging her question. The look-alike doll in the foyer moved. Claire didn't see it happen, but when she blinked, its porcelain hand was raised, pointing to the tiny staircase leading to the upper floor. Her chest tightened. She reached out, gripping the edge of the dollhouse, and leaned closer. The upstairs bedroom door was ajar, and faint laughter, childlike and haunting, drifted out. Claire recoiled, her heart hammering in her chest. The laughter grew louder, echoing through her living room now. It was as if the dollhouse was no longer contained, its eerie presence spilling out into her world. Claire grabbed the miniature front door and slammed it shut. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. But the moment she stepped back, the real front door of her house creaked open. Claire whipped around, her blood running cold. The hallway beyond was dark, the night pressing against the windows. She could see nothing, but she felt something watching her. "No," she muttered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." The dollhouse lights flared, and a chilling voice whispered, "Let us in." Claire's survival instincts kicked in. She grabbed a blanket from the couch and threw it over the dollhouse, covering it completely. The lights dimmed, and the whispers stopped, replaced by an ominous stillness. She backed away, her mind racing. If the dollhouse wanted to come in, what would happen if she destroyed it? Her gaze darted to the fireplace. Without thinking, she seized the dollhouse, blanket and all, and carried it to the hearth. Her muscles strained as she hoisted it into the flames. The fire roared to life, consuming the delicate wood and porcelain. For a moment, she felt relief. But then the house around her began to groan, as though in protest. The walls shuddered, and the laughter returned, louder and more menacing than before. Claire screamed as the fire exploded outward, a blinding light filling the room. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her living room. She stood in a tiny parlor, her surroundings eerily familiar. Her gaze fell on a velvet couch, where 3 porcelain dolls sat in perfect silence. One of them was her look-alike, its painted face frozen in an expression of serene contentment. She tried to move but found her body stiff and unyielding. She couldn't scream, couldn't blink. Her reflection in the glass of the dollhouse's tiny window revealed the truth. She was no longer Claire. She was the 4th doll. Outside, the dollhouse stood pristine on its table, the blanket gone and its lights glowing softly. The miniature clock ticked forward, its hands stopping at 3:19. The elevator ritual, episode 1, the sequence. It all began as a dare. Mina, Jack, and Laura sat in the dimly lit common room of their college dorm, the glow of their phones casting eerie shadows on their faces. Jack had stumbled upon a viral post about the elevator ritual, an urban legend claiming that by following a precise sequence of floors in an elevator, one could access a dimension hidden from the world. "It's probably just a prank," Laura said, sipping her coffee. "Someone made it up to scare people." "Only one way to find out," Jack replied with a smirk, holding up his phone. "There's an abandoned office building downtown. It still has power, and it's got an old elevator, perfect for this." Mina hesitated, glancing between her friends. "This sounds like a bad idea." "What if something actually happens?" Jack rolled his eyes. "Come on, Mina. It's just an elevator ride. You're not scared, are you?" That night, they stood before the building, its facade a crumbling relic of the 80s. The windows were dark, and the air carried a metallic tang. Mina shivered as Jack pushed open the heavy front door. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by their footsteps echoing off the marble floor. "This place gives me the creeps," Laura muttered. "Relax," Jack said, pulling out his phone. I've got the sequence right here. First, we go to the 4th floor. The elevator was ancient, its metal doors scratched and dented. Mina hesitated before stepping inside, her unease growing with each second. Jack hit the button for the 4th floor, and the elevator jolted to life, rattling as it ascended. The ritual required them to visit a series of floors in a specific order: 4, 2, 6, 2, 10, 5. As they followed the sequence, the air inside the elevator seemed to grow heavier, the fluorescent light flickering above them. By the time they reached the 5th floor, Mina's nerves were frayed. "I don't like this," she said, clutching the railing. "It feels wrong." Jack was about to respond when the elevator doors slid open to the 5th floor. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, and a faint hum filled the air. None of them moved. "Jack," Laura whispered. "Did you hear that?" A distant sound echoed down the corridor, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Mina's grip on the railing tightened. "Let's just finish this and get out of here," Jack said, his bravado faltering. He pressed the button for the 1st floor, the final step of the ritual. As the elevator began its descent, the hum grew louder, resonating through the walls. The lights flickered wildly, plunging them into moments of total darkness. Mina felt her heart race as an oppressive weight pressed down on her chest. When the elevator stopped, the doors opened with a groan. But instead of the lobby, they were greeted by an otherworldly scene. The walls of the corridor were covered in shifting shadows, and the air felt thick and suffocating. The hum had transformed into a low, guttural growl. "What is this?" Laura's voice quivered. Jack's face was pale. "I don't know. This isn't supposed to happen." Mina stepped forward, her legs trembling. The shadows seemed to writhe and reach toward her, whispering unintelligible words. She turned to her friends, her voice shaking. "We need to leave, now." Jack frantically hit the button for the 1st floor, but the elevator didn't respond. The growling grew louder, the shadows pressing closer. Then, the doors began to close on their own. Episode 2, Into the Void. The elevator doors slammed shut, trapping Mina, Jack, and Laura inside. The growling noise outside receded, replaced by an eerie silence. Jack frantically jabbed the button for the 1st floor, but nothing happened. The buttons flickered erratically, and the elevator remained motionless. "What did you do, Jack?" Laura's voice cracked with panic. "I just followed the sequence," Jack protested, his voice trembling. "This isn't supposed to happen." Mina's breathing quickened as she backed into the corner of the elevator. "We need to stay calm. There's got to be a way out of this." The lights above them flickered again, plunging the elevator into darkness for a few terrifying seconds. When they came back on, the atmosphere had changed. The metallic walls seemed duller, almost corroded, and the air was colder, carrying a faint metallic tang. Laura pressed her ear to the elevator door. "It's so quiet now," she whispered, her voice barely audible, too quiet. As if in response, the elevator jolted violently, throwing all 3 of them to the floor. The hum from earlier returned, louder and deeper, reverberating through their bodies. Slowly, the elevator began to descend, though no one had pressed a button. "Where is it taking us?" Mina asked, clutching the railing to steady herself. Jack shook his head, fear etched into his face. "I don't know. This wasn't part of the ritual." The elevator's descent grew faster, the hum intensifying until it was almost deafening. Then, with a sudden, jarring stop, the elevator came to a halt. The doors slid open, revealing an unsettling landscape. They stepped into a vast, dimly lit space that seemed to stretch infinitely. The floor was smooth and reflective, like black glass, and the air was thick with a suffocating silence. Strange, faintly glowing symbols were etched into the walls, pulsating with an otherworldly light. "Where are we?" Laura whispered, clutching Mina's arm. Jack's eyes darted around, searching for any sign of familiarity. "I don't know. This can't be real." Mina took a cautious step forward, her shoes making no sound against the strange surface. As they moved deeper into the space, the air grew colder, and a low, whispering sound began to surround them. The whispers were indistinct at first, like the rustling of leaves, but soon they formed words. "Why did you come?" the voices murmured. "You should not be here." Panic set in as the whispers grew louder, overlapping and echoing from every direction. Mina spun around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing but emptiness. "We need to go back," she said urgently. "We need to get back in the elevator." Laura nodded, already retreating toward the open doors. Jack hesitated, his gaze fixed on a faint light in the distance. "Wait," he said. "There's something out there. Maybe it's a way out." "Are you insane?" Laura snapped. "We don't know what's out there. We need to leave now." But Jack was already moving toward the light, his curiosity overpowering his fear. Mina hesitated, torn between following him and staying with Laura. "Jack, don't," she called after him, her voice echoing in the emptiness. He turned back to face them, his expression resolute. "I have to see what it is. You two can go back if you want, but I can't leave without knowing." Before Mina could respond, the whisper suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise, pressing in on them like a physical weight. Then, from the darkness, a shadowy figure began to emerge, its form shifting and flickering as if it were made of smoke. "Run!" Mina screamed, grabbing Laura and pulling her toward the elevator. Jack froze, staring at the figure as it moved closer. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, and a low growl emanated from its shapeless form. Mina and Laura reached the elevator, slamming the button frantically. The doors began to close, but Jack was still standing in the distance, paralyzed by fear. "Jack, move!" Laura shouted, her voice breaking. The figure lunged toward him just as the elevator doors shut, cutting off their view. The hum returned, and the elevator began to ascend, shaking violently as it did. Mina collapsed against the wall, tears streaming down her face. "We left him," she whispered. "We left him." Laura was silent, her hands trembling. The elevator's ascent slowed, and when the doors opened again, they were back in the building lobby. Everything looked exactly as it had when they arrived, but something was different. The air felt heavier, and the shadows seemed darker. Mina and Laura stepped out, their legs weak. They turned back to the elevator, but the doors were already closing. The buttons inside flickered once before the elevator disappeared, leaving behind only an empty shaft. Episode 3, The Final Descent. The lobby was eerily silent as Mina and Laura stood frozen, staring at the empty elevator shaft. The faint hum they had heard earlier was gone, leaving a void that seemed to echo in their ears. Laura clutched Mina's arm, her knuckles white with tension. "What just happened?" Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. Mina shook her head, trying to steady her breathing. "I don't know, but Jackie's still down there. We have to get help." Laura glanced at the building's exit, her instinct screaming to run. "What if we can't help him? What if she couldn't finish the thought," her voice breaking. Before Mina could respond, the hum returned, faint and distant. Both girls turned toward the elevator shaft. The sound grew louder, resonating through the walls, and with it came a chilling whisper that sent shivers down their spines. "Why did you leave?" The voice was unmistakably Jack's, but it carried an unnatural, distorted quality. Mina took a hesitant step toward the shaft, peering into its darkness. "Jack," she called out, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" The hum intensified, and the whisper came again, this time louder. "You shouldn't have left me." Suddenly, the elevator doors slammed shut, though the elevator itself was nowhere to be seen. The lights in the lobby flickered, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. Laura grabbed Mina's arm, pulling her back. "We need to leave, now." But before they could move, the floor beneath them vibrated, and a low, guttural growl echoed from deep within the building. The sound was followed by the faint clinking of chains, growing louder with each passing second. Without warning, the elevator's buttons lit up, cycling through the floors in rapid succession. The display glitched, flashing symbols instead of numbers, and the growl morphed into a chorus of overlapping whispers. "Stay, come back, join us." Laura screamed, dragging Mina toward the exit. They ran through the lobby, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. Just as they reached the door, it slammed shut, locking them inside. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Mina pounded on the door, desperation taking over. "Let us out, please." A chilling laugh echoed through the room, and the hum shifted into a steady pulse, like a heartbeat. The elevator doors slid open behind them, revealing the car. It was bathed in a faint red light, and standing inside was Jack. Mina and Laura froze. Jack's form was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural light. He tilted his head, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You left me," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "But it's okay. You can stay now." Mina shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "Jack, we didn't mean to. We tried to save you." Jack stepped out of the elevator, his movements jerky and unnatural. The air around him seemed to ripple, distorting the space. "It's too late for that. You can't leave." Laura backed away, pulling Mina with her. "We're not staying here. We're leaving, with or without you." Jack's expression darkened, and the whispers surged, filling the room with a deafening cacophony. The shadows in the lobby writhed, taking on grotesque forms that began to close in on them. Mina and Laura bolted toward a staircase they had noticed earlier. The whispers followed them, growing louder as they climbed. The stairs seemed endless, spiraling upward with no end in sight. Laura's legs burned, and Mina's lungs felt like they might burst, but they didn't stop. Finally, they burst through a door, finding themselves back in the lobby. Everything was eerily still, as if nothing had happened. The elevator doors were closed, the buttons unlit, and the oppressive hum was gone. "Did we escape?" Laura asked, her voice shaking. Mina didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the elevator. The doors slid open slowly, revealing an empty car. She took a cautious step forward, but Laura grabbed her arm. "Don't," Laura said firmly. "We're leaving, right now." Mina nodded, and together they ran out of the building, into the cold night air. The street was empty, the world outside blissfully normal. But as they walked away, neither of them spoke, the weight of what they had experienced settling heavily on their shoulders. Weeks later, Mina sat alone in her dorm room, unable to sleep. She stared at her phone, scrolling through old photos. A notification popped up, startling her. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you leave?" Her blood ran cold as the screen flickered, and the faint hum began to fill the room. The Forgotten Road, Episode 1, A Wrong Turn. It was supposed to be a simple road trip. For friends Chris, Sarah, Mia, and Jake set out to explore the countryside, their car packed with snacks, maps, and a playlist of nostalgic songs. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and purple as they laughed and joked about the small towns they'd passed through. But their laughter faded as they realized they were lost. The GPS had been leading them along a winding forest road when it abruptly lost signal. Chris, who was driving, tried to reassure everyone. "It's fine. These old country roads all connect somewhere. We'll find our way back to the highway." Yet, the road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense trees that seemed to press closer with every mile. There were no signs, no intersections, and no other cars. Only the narrow, unmarked path and the growing sense of unease. "Chris, maybe we should turn around," Sarah suggested, her voice tight. "We haven't seen a single sign of civilization in over an hour." "And go where?" Chris replied, gripping the wheel tightly. "The GPS is dead, and I don't remember passing any turnoffs." "Guys, look," Mia's voice cut through the tension. She pointed ahead to a faded wooden sign barely visible in the twilight. It read, "Red Hollow, 3 miles in peeling paint." "A town?" Jake asked, leaning forward. "Finally, let's check it out. They might have a gas station or something." Chris hesitated but eventually nodded. "Okay, 3 miles. If it's a dead end, we turn around." The road grew narrower as they drove, the trees arching overhead like skeletal fingers. Shadows danced in their headlights, creating eerie shapes that seemed to move just out of sight. The friends fell silent, the car's engine the only sound breaking the oppressive stillness. When they reached the 3-mile mark, they saw it, a fork in the road. To the left, the path continued into darkness. To the right, an even narrower dirt road led to a clearing where a single building stood. It was a diner. The neon sign flickered weakly, spelling out Red Hollow Diner in jagged letters. The parking lot was empty, and the windows were dark, but the sight of something man-made was a relief. "Should we stop?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't have much choice," Chris said, pulling into the lot. Maybe someone inside can help. The air outside was cold and carried a faint metallic scent. The friends approached the diner cautiously, their footsteps crunching on gravel. Chris pushed the door open, and a bell jingled overhead. Inside, the diner looked frozen in time. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter stretched across the room. A jukebox stood in the corner, its lights flickering faintly. Yet, there was no one there. "Hello," Sarah called out, her voice echoing. Silence. "Maybe it's closed," Jake suggested, though the door had been unlocked. "Then why leave the sign on?" Mia muttered, glancing around nervously. Chris stepped behind the counter, searching for any sign of life. That's when he saw it. A notebook lying open next to an old rotary phone. The pages were filled with frantic handwriting, the same phrase repeated over and over. "Don't take the road. Don't take the road. Don't take the road." "Guys," Chris said, his voice shaking. He held up the notebook, and the others crowded around. Before they could process what they were seeing, the jukebox sprang to life, blasting an old rock and roll tune. The friends jumped, their nerves already frayed. Jake hurried to unplug the machine, but as he did, the neon sign outside flickered and died, plunging the diner into darkness. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Chris didn't argue. They stumbled back to the car, the flashlight on Mia's phone their only guide. Once inside, Chris started the engine and threw the car into reverse. But as the headlights illuminated the road behind them, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A figure stood in the middle of the road, tall and motionless. It was cloaked in shadow, its features obscured. For a moment, no one moved, the weight of the figure's gaze if it even had eyes bearing down on them. Then, it took a step forward. "Go," Mia screamed. Chris floored the accelerator, swerving around the figure and back onto the road. The car sped down the narrow path, the forest blurring past. No one spoke, their fear palpable. But the road didn't end. No matter how far they drove, it stretched on endlessly, the same trees, the same shadows, looping back on themselves. And when they dared to glance behind them, they saw the figure again, closer now, keeping pace with the car. By the time they realized the road wouldn't let them leave, it was too late. The headlights flickered, and the engine began to sputter. The whispers started soon after, soft at first, then growing louder, surrounding them. They were no longer alone on the forgotten road. Episode 2, The Endless Loop. The car's engine sputtered one final time before dying completely. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging the road into a suffocating darkness. Inside the car, the four friends sat frozen, their breaths shallow and rapid. The only sound was the faint rustle of leaves in the wind, but even that felt unnervingly distant. "What the hell just happened?" Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Chris gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "I don't know. The car just stopped." "This isn't normal," Sarah said, glancing nervously out the window. "None of this is normal. That thing was following us." "It's gone now," Mia said, though her voice betrayed her uncertainty. She was clutching her phone, but the screen showed no signal and no battery, despite having been fully charged earlier. Chris tried the ignition again, but the engine only groaned in protest. "Great, now what? We walk," Jake said firmly. "We can't just sit here and wait for whatever that was to come back." "Walk where?" Mia shot back. "This road doesn't end. We've been driving for hours, and it just keeps going." "We don't have a choice," Sarah said, opening the door. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint metallic scent they had noticed earlier. She shivered but stepped out, clutching her jacket tightly. "Sitting here isn't going to solve anything." Reluctantly, the others followed. Chris grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, its weak beam barely cutting through the darkness. Together, they started walking, their footsteps crunching on the gravel road. The forest was unnaturally silent. No insects chirped, no animals rustled in the underbrush. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. The friends stayed close, their eyes darting to every shadow. After what felt like an eternity, they saw lights in the distance. Finally, Jake said, his voice breaking the tense silence. "Maybe it's a house or another town." They quickened their pace, hope flickering in their hearts. But as they approached, Their steps faltered. The lights weren't coming from a house or a town. They were back at the diner. "No," Mia whispered, her voice trembling. "That's impossible. We walked straight. We didn't turn around." "It's some kind of trick," Chris said, though he didn't sound convinced. The diner stood exactly as they had left it, its neon sign flickering weakly in the oppressive darkness. The door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in a breeze none of them could feel. "We're not going back in there," Sarah said firmly. "Let's just keep walking. There has to be a way out." They turned and started down the road again, their resolve renewed. But no matter how far they walked, the road never changed. The same trees, the same shadows, the same oppressive silence. And every time they thought they were making progress, they found themselves back at the diner. By the fourth time, panic set in. "This isn't real," Jake said, pacing frantically. "It's some kind of nightmare. We're dreaming. We have to be dreaming. If it's a dream, why can't we wake up?" Sarah shot back, tears streaming down her face. "Why does it feel so real?" "We're being toyed with," Mia said quietly, staring at the diner. "Whatever's out here, it's keeping us trapped. It wants us here." "No," Chris said, shaking his head. "We're getting out of here. I don't care what it takes." He marched toward the diner, determination etched into his face. The others hesitated but eventually followed. The interior was exactly as they had left it, down to the overturned chair near the counter. Chris headed straight for the notebook, flipping through its pages. "There has to be something in here," he muttered. "A clue. Anything." As he turned the pages, the jukebox sprang to life again, playing the same eerie tune as before. This time, however, the lights in the diner flickered violently. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, coming from every corner of the room. "Turn back, turn back, turn back." The friends huddled together, fear gripping them as the shadows in the room began to shift. From the corner of her eye, Mia saw movement near the window. She turned and froze. The figure was there, staring at them through the glass. Its form was clearer now, tall and impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. As it moved closer, the whispers grew into a deafening roar. "Leave." The lights went out. When they came back on, the diner was empty. The figure was gone, but the oppressive feeling remained. Chris slammed the notebook shut and turned to the others. "We can't stay here," he said. "Whatever this thing is, it's not going to let us go unless we fight back." "Fight back," Sarah repeated, incredulous. "How do you fight something like that?" Chris didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed a metal rod from behind the counter and headed for the door. As they stepped outside, the air was colder than ever. The road stretched before them, the forest unnaturally still. For the first time, they noticed something new, faint markings etched into the gravel, forming a trail that led deeper into the woods. "It's leading us somewhere," Mia said, her voice a mix of fear and curiosity. "Then we follow it," Chris said, gripping the rod tightly. "Whatever's at the end of this road, we're going to find it, and we're going to end this." The friends exchanged uneasy glances but nodded. With no other options, they stepped off the road and into the woods, following the trail into the unknown. Episode 3, The Final Path. The trail led them deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser with each step. Their flashlight beams flickered, casting long, distorted shadows that danced around them. The whispers had returned, soft at first but steadily growing louder, as if the forest itself was alive and murmuring secrets they couldn't understand. "Are we sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. She glanced nervously at the markings on the ground, which seemed to glow faintly in the dark. "Do we have a choice?" Chris replied, not stopping. His grip on the metal rod tightened as he led the group. "Whatever's doing this, it wants us to follow. We're not getting out unless we face it." Mia clutched her phone, though it was useless now. She stayed close to Jake, who was uncharacteristically silent. None of them dared to look back, afraid of what might be following them. After what felt like hours, the trail ended abruptly at a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone archway, covered in moss and etched with strange symbols. A faint, otherworldly light pulsed from within, illuminating the area with an eerie glow. "What is that?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a doorway," Mia said, stepping closer, or a gate, but to where? Before anyone could answer, the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. From the shadows, the figure emerged. It was no longer a vague silhouette. The being stood impossibly tall, its body shrouded in a dark, shifting mist. Its eyes burned like twin embers, locking onto the group with an intensity that froze them in place. "Stay together," Chris said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. He raised the metal rod, though it felt pitifully inadequate against the entity before them. The figure raised an arm, and the ground beneath them trembled. The symbols on the archway began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with the whispers. The air was thick with a sense of inevitability, as if they were standing on the precipice of something they couldn't comprehend. "What do you want from us?" Sarah screamed, her voice breaking through the cacophony. The figure tilted its head, as if considering her question. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, it spoke, "Choose." The friends exchanged panicked glances. "Choose what?" Mia demanded. The figure gestured to the archway, the light within growing brighter. Images began to flicker inside it. Memories of the four friends, their laughter, their arguments, their secrets. It was as if the gate was showing them their own lives. "It's showing us who we are," Jake said, his voice trembling. "Why?" "Because one of us has to go," Chris realized, his voice hollow. "It's asking for a sacrifice." The weight of his words sank in. The whispers grew quieter, waiting. The figure remained motionless, its burning eyes fixed on them. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "There has to be another way. We've come this far. We can fight it." "With what?" Jake snapped. "We're out of options, Sarah. It wants one of us." "I'll do it," Chris said suddenly. He stepped forward, lowering the metal rod. "This started when I decided to take the road. It's my fault we're here. If this is the only way to end it, then I'll go." "No." Mia grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this." "Yes, I do," Chris said, gently pulling away. "If it gets you all out of here, it's worth it." Chris stepped toward the archway. As he approached, the light grew blinding, and the whispers surged again, this time carrying an edge of approval. The figure watched silently as Chris turned to face his friends one last time. "Take care of each other," he said. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped through the gate. The light flared, enveloping him completely. Then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The archway stood dark and silent, the forest eerily still. The figure was gone. The road reappeared. Sarah, Mia, and Jake found themselves back at the car, the engine humming softly as if nothing had happened. The oppressive darkness was gone, replaced by the soft glow of dawn breaking over the horizon, but Chris was nowhere to be found. The Ghostly Passenger, Episode 1, The Stormy Fair. The rain pelted down in sheets, the kind of storm that made the city streets glisten like black mirrors. Ravi gripped the steering wheel of his taxi, his knuckles white as he squinted through the windshield. The wipers struggled to keep up, smearing water rather than clearing it. Business had been slow tonight. Most people preferred to stay indoors on such a treacherous evening. As he rounded a corner onto an empty street, a figure appeared in his headlights. A woman stood on the curb, her hand raised to flag him down. She was drenched, her long black hair clinging to her face, but there was something almost otherworldly about her stillness amidst the chaotic storm. Ravi hesitated for a moment before pulling over. Rolling down the passenger side window, he called out, "Need a ride?" The woman nodded, her lips pale and her eyes hollow. Without a word, she opened the door and slid into the back seat, her movements deliberate and silent. Water pooled on the leather seats as she settled in, clutching a small bag to her chest. "Where to?" Ravi asked, glancing at her through the rearview mirror. "Hillcrest Cemetery," she said, her voice soft but firm. It sent a chill down Ravi's spine, though he couldn't explain why. He wasn't one to question a fare, especially on a night like this, so he nodded and pulled back onto the road. The drive was silent save for the rhythmic thrum of rain on the roof and the occasional crack of thunder. Ravi stole glances at his passenger through the mirror. She sat unnaturally still, her face turned toward the window, though there was little to see outside but darkness and streaks of rain. Rough night, huh? He ventured, trying to break the silence. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she tightened her grip on the bag and leaned slightly forward, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Ravi decided not to push further, focusing instead on navigating the slick streets. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the buildings gave way to open fields and dense trees. The storm seemed to intensify, the wind howling as if in warning. The headlights barely pierced the darkness, but the cemetery gates eventually came into view, their wrought iron spikes gleaming whitely in the rain. Ravi slowed the car and turned to speak to his passenger. "We're here," but the back seat was empty. Panic surged through him as he twisted around to check. The woman's bag lay on the seat, its surface damp but undisturbed. Ravi's heart raced. He could have sworn he hadn't heard the door open or close. The locks were still engaged. He stepped out of the car, the rain immediately soaking him to the bone. "Hello," he called, his voice shaky. He looked around but saw no sign of her. The cemetery loomed ahead, its headstones barely visible in the gloom. Ravi hesitated, then grabbed the bag from the back seat. Maybe it held some clue. Under the dim glow of the car's interior light, he unzipped the bag. Inside was a single photograph, faded and creased. It showed a young woman, the same woman who had been in his cab, standing beside a gravestone. The name on the stone was barely legible, but Ravi could make out the date. She had died 10 years ago. His breath caught as a chill ran down his spine. From the shadows near the cemetery gates, he thought he saw movement. A fleeting glimpse of her figure, standing still and watching him, before disappearing into the darkness. Ravi didn't wait to find out more. He jumped back into his cab, the photograph still clutched in his hand, and sped away from the cemetery. But no matter how fast he drove, the feeling of being watched lingered, as if unseen eyes were following him through the storm. When he finally returned to the city, the rain had eased, but Ravi couldn't shake the image of the woman's pale face or the photograph in her bag. He knew one thing for certain. He had picked up a passenger that night, but she had never really been there. The Ghostly Passenger, Episode 2, Shadows of the Past. Ravi couldn't sleep that night. The photograph weighed heavily on his mind, its haunting image burned into his thoughts. He had placed it on his kitchen table, staring at it under the harsh fluorescent light. The woman in the picture, her face so vivid and familiar, made his skin crawl. The name on the gravestone was barely decipherable, but after staring at it for hours, Ravi believed it read, Amara Patel. With a deep breath, he resolved to learn more. He had to know who she was and why she had appeared in his taxi. The next day, the storm had passed, leaving the city under a dreary gray sky. Ravi took the photograph to a local library, hoping to find some answers. The librarian, an older woman with kind eyes, helped him navigate the archives. Amara Patel, Ravi said hesitantly, showing her the photograph. "Do you recognize this name?" The librarian squinted at the image, her expression growing somber. "I remember hearing about her," she said softly. "It was a tragedy." Amara was a young woman who died in a car accident just outside the city. It happened about 10 years ago, during a storm much like the one last night. Ravi felt a chill creep up his spine. Where can I find more information? The librarian directed him to the newspaper archives. After hours of searching, Ravi found an article about the accident. The headline read, "Young woman dies in crash on Cemetery Road." The article described how Emira's car had skidded off the road in heavy rain and collided with a tree near Hillcrest Cemetery. She had been driving home late at night, alone. The article included another photograph of Amara. Ravi's stomach turned as he recognized the same hauntingly pale face of his passenger. The drive back to Hillcrest Cemetery was filled with unease. Ravi couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something far beyond his understanding. He arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple. The cemetery gates stood open, inviting yet ominous. Clutching the photograph, Ravi walked through the rows of gravestones, the damp earth squelching beneath his shoes. He searched for her name, his heart pounding with every step. Finally, he found it. Amara Patel. The gravestone was weathered, its edges worn smooth by time, but her name and the dates were still clear. She had died at the age of 27. "Why did you get in my taxi?" Ravi whispered, his voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The air grew colder, and the surrounding silence was broken by a faint sound, the soft rustle of leaves, though there was no wind. Ravi turned, his eyes scanning the darkening cemetery, but he saw no one. As he stood by the grave, he felt an overwhelming urge to leave. But just as he turned to go, he noticed something at the base of the gravestone, a small, weathered locket. Kneeling down, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a tiny photograph of a smiling Amara, accompanied by a man Ravi didn't recognize. The initials AP plus or K were engraved inside the locket. That night, back in his apartment, Ravi examined the locket under the dim kitchen light. The man in the photograph looked familiar, but Ravi couldn't place him. He felt as though the pieces of a puzzle were slowly coming together, but the picture they formed remained unclear. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. The text read, "She's waiting." Ravi's heart stopped. He stared at the screen, his mind racing. Who had sent the message, and what did it mean? Before he could process it, the power in his apartment flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. In the silence that followed, a single sound echoed through the room, a faint, familiar voice whispering his name. Episode 3, The Final Ride. The air in Ravi's apartment was thick with dread. The message on his phone and the whispered voice left him trembling. Clutching the locket tightly, he resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. The city was quiet as Ravi stepped out into the night, his taxi parked just outside. The storm from the previous night had cleared, leaving the streets damp and glistening under the moonlight. Ravi slid into the driver's seat, the photograph and locket resting on the dashboard. He had no clear destination but felt compelled to drive. As he navigated the familiar streets, his mind raced. Who was the man in the locket? And why had Amara chosen him, a simple taxi driver, to carry her story? The questions circled endlessly, but the answers remained elusive. An hour into his aimless drive, Ravi noticed something strange. The city streets began to change. Buildings he'd driven past countless times looked unfamiliar, their facades older, weathered. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows. Ravi checked his phone for GPS, but the screen showed no signal. His heart pounded as he realized he was no longer in the city he knew. Ahead, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Ravi's breath caught as he recognized her. Amara. She stood under a flickering streetlight, her black hair shimmering in the pale glow. This time, she wasn't drenched, and her expression was softer, almost pleading. Ravi hesitated but pulled over. The passenger door opened, and Amara slid into the back seat, just as she had before. "Take me home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ravi gripped the wheel. "Where is home?" Amara's gaze met his in the rearview mirror, her eyes glistening with unspoken sorrow. "You already know," she replied. The taxi moved forward, guided by an unseen force. Ravi's hands trembled as the roads twisted and turned, leading him back to Hillcrest Cemetery. The gates stood wide open, and the path ahead was bathed in an otherworldly light. Ravi parked just outside, his heart racing. "Why here?" he asked, turning to face her. But the back seat was empty again. Ravi stepped out of the car, the locket and photograph clutched tightly in his hand. He walked through the cemetery, the air cold and heavy. As he approached Amara's gravestone, he noticed the faint outline of a man standing beside it. The figure turned to face him. It was the man from the locket. "Who are you?" Ravi demanded, his voice shaking. The man's expression was solemn. "I'm Rayesh," he said, "Amara's fiancé." Ravi's mind reeled. What is all this? Why is she haunting me? Rayesh sighed, his gaze dropping to the gravestone. "She's not haunting you. She's trying to find peace." He gestured to the locket in Ravi's hand. "That was meant for me. She was on her way to meet me the night she died. We were supposed to run away together, to start a new life. But the storm ... double quotes his voice broke. Ravi felt a pang of guilt. "Why me? What can I do?" "You were the one who listened," Rayesh said. "She needed someone to bring her back here, to remind her of who she was and what she wanted. Now, she can finally rest." As Rayesh spoke, a soft glow enveloped the cemetery. Ravi turned to see Amara standing beside her grave, her expression serene. She nodded at him, a silent thank you, before fading into the light. The cemetery returned to darkness, and Rayesh was gone. Ravi stood alone, the locket warm in his hand. He placed it gently at the base of Amara's gravestone, a sense of calm washing over him. When he returned to his taxi, the photograph and the locket were no longer on the dashboard. The city streets were familiar again, and the night felt oddly peaceful. As Ravi drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see her. But the back seat was empty, and for the first time since the stormy night, Ravi felt truly alone. Yet, he knew he'd never forget the ghostly passenger who had changed his life forever. The Haunted Toy, Episode 1, The Whisper in the Dark. It started on a quiet evening, the kind of night when the world outside felt muffled and distant. Mia, a 10-year-old with a fascination for vintage toys, had spent the day exploring her grandmother's attic. Among the dust-covered trunks and forgotten relics, she discovered a peculiar doll. Its porcelain face was cracked but strangely lifelike, with glassy blue eyes that seemed to follow her every move. The doll wore a faded blue dress with lace trim, and its tiny mouth was set in a faint, enigmatic smile. "What's this?" Mia asked, holding up the doll to show her grandmother. Her grandmother's expression darkened for a moment before she forced a smile. "Oh, just an old toy. It's been up there for years. You can keep it if you like." Mia's excitement overshadowed the hesitation in her grandmother's voice. She took the doll home, placing it carefully on a shelf in her room. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought she heard something, a faint whispering sound. Sitting up, she scanned the room. The doll was still on the shelf, its glassy eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Hello," Mia called out softly, feeling a chill creep up her spine. The whispering stopped. The next morning, Mia brushed off the experience as her imagination playing tricks on her. But the whispers returned the following night, clearer this time. They seemed to come from the doll. "Mia, play with me." She froze, her heart pounding. Gathering her courage, she approached the shelf. The doll remained motionless, its painted smile unchanging. She picked it up, studying its face closely. "It's just a doll," she told herself. "It can't talk." But the unease lingered. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Mia would find the doll in different positions from where she left it. Sometimes it would be facing the window, other times it would be lying on her desk. Once, she discovered it sitting upright on her bed, its tiny hands resting on the covers as if it had been waiting for her. "Mom, do you think dolls can move by themselves?" Mia asked one evening at dinner. Her mother laughed. "Of course not, sweetie. Maybe you're just forgetting where you put it." Mia nodded, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. That night, the whispering grew louder. It wasn't just a single voice anymore. It sounded like a chorus of soft, hissing words. Mia clutched her blanket tightly, her eyes fixed on the doll. Suddenly, its head tilted ever so slightly, and its lips parted. "Play with me, Mia," it whispered, its voice a chilling blend of innocence and malice. Mia screamed, throwing the doll across the room. Her parents rushed in, turning on the lights. The doll lay crumpled on the floor, its lifeless eyes staring up at the ceiling. "What happened?" her mother asked, kneeling beside her. "It had talked," Mia stammered. "The doll talked to me." Her father picked up the doll, examining it. "It's just an old toy," he said. "Maybe you had a bad dream." Mia shook her head. "No, it moved. I saw it." Her parents exchanged worried glances but decided not to press the issue. They placed the doll back on the shelf and tucked Mia into bed, assuring her that everything was fine. But everything was not fine. As the house settled into silence, Mia's room grew colder. She shivered under her blanket, her eyes darting to the shelf. The doll was gone. From the darkness, the whispering began again, closer this time. "Mia, don't be afraid." A shadow shifted in the corner of the room, and the doll stepped into the moonlight, its glassy eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. Mia could only watch, frozen with terror, as the doll raised its tiny hand and pointed at her. The Haunted Toy, Episode 2, Shadows of the Past. Mia barely slept after the horrifying encounter with the doll. Her parents dismissed her terrified recount as an overactive imagination, but she knew what she had seen. The next morning, she resolved to get rid of the doll. She stuffed it into a bag and biked to the edge of town, where an old, overgrown ravine lay hidden by the forest. With trembling hands, Mia threw the bag into the ravine, watching as it tumbled out of sight. A sense of relief washed over her as she rode home. But that night, as the wind howled outside, a familiar whispering filled her room. "You can't get rid of me, Mia." She bolted upright, her heart pounding. The doll was back, sitting on the shelf where it had always been, its glassy eyes gleaming in the dim light. The next day, Mia turned to the only person she thought might believe her grandmother. She biked to her grandmother's house and burst into the cozy living room, where the elderly woman was knitting by the fire. "Grandma, the doll. It came back. It's alive," Mia blurted out. Her grandmother's hands stilled, and a shadow crossed her face. She sighed deeply and gestured for Mia to sit. "There's something I need to tell you," she began. Mia listened intently as her grandmother explained the doll's sinister origins. It had belonged to her great-aunt Clara, a troubled girl who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. After her death, the doll was found in Clara's room, sitting on the bed with its head tilted as if watching something unseen. "They said the doll was cursed," her grandmother whispered. "Clara, she'd spend hours talking to it. And then, one day, she was gone. No one knows what happened." Mia felt a chill run down her spine. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "I thought it was just an old story," her grandmother admitted. "But if the doll is truly cursed, it's drawn to fear. That's how it survives. What do I do?" Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "You have to confront it," her grandmother said. "You can't let it feed on your fear. Stand your ground and show it you're not afraid." That night, Mia returned home with a newfound resolve. She placed the doll in the center of her room and sat across from it, her flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. The whispering started almost immediately, the doll's painted lips parting ever so slightly. "Play with me, Mia." Mia's hands trembled, but she clenched her fists and stared at the doll. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. The whispering stopped, and the room grew eerily silent. The doll's glassy eyes seemed to narrow, its expression shifting to one of anger. The shadows on the walls began to move, swirling and stretching as if alive. Mia's heart raced, but she kept her gaze locked on the doll. "Leave me alone," she said firmly. "You don't control me." The doll let out a high-pitched giggle, a sound that sent shivers down Mia's spine. The shadows surged toward her, but as they neared, she shouted, "Go away." The shadows froze, and the doll's giggle turned into a low hiss. Its porcelain face began to crack further, spiderweb fractures spreading across its surface. With a final, deafening snap, the doll shattered into pieces, the room plunging into silence. Mia exhaled shakily, her body trembling with relief. She carefully gathered the fragments of the doll and placed them in a box, sealing it tightly. The next morning, she and her grandmother buried the box in the woods, ensuring it would never harm anyone again. Or so they thought. The Haunted Toy, Episode 3, The Final Game. For a while, things seemed to return to normal. Mia slept peacefully, free from the whispers and the doll's chilling presence. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Cursed things have a way of coming back. It was a crisp autumn evening when the unease returned. Mia's family was hosting a yard sale, and strangers wandered their property, browsing old items laid out on tables. As Mia helped her mother, she felt an icy prickle at the back of her neck. She turned to see a man in a tattered coat holding something familiar, the box where she and her grandmother had buried the doll's fragments. Her heart sank. "Where did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's smile was unsettling. "Found it in the woods," he said. "Thought it might be worth something." Mia's mother waved the man off, dismissing the box as junk, but Mia's unease only grew. That night, she lay awake, unable to stop thinking about the box. The air in her room felt heavy, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the walls. At midnight, the whispering began again. "Mia." Her breath hitched as she sat up. The doll's fragments, still locked in the box in the corner of the room, began to rattle. The whispering grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, pleading and demanding. Let us out. Mia sprang from her bed and grabbed the box. She ran to her grandmother's house, desperate for help. Her grandmother answered the door, her face pale as she saw the trembling girl clutching the cursed box. It's back, Mia whispered, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what to do. Her grandmother took a deep breath and led Mia inside. There's one final way to end this, she said, but it will require great courage. Together, they opened the family's old spellbook, searching for a way to banish the curse for good. The ritual required them to confront the doll's spirit and sever its connection to the mortal world. They gathered candles, salt, and an old mirror from the attic. With the box of fragments placed at the center of a salt circle, they began the ritual. As the candles flickered, the room grew colder. Shadows coalesced in the mirror, forming the outline of a young girl, Clara. Her face was pale, her eyes dark voids that seemed to pierce through Mia. You took my doll, Clara hissed, her voice echoing unnaturally. You have to play with me. Mia's grandmother's voice rang out firmly. We're here to free you, Clara. You don't belong in this world anymore. The spirit screamed, and the box shattered open, the doll's fragments rising into the air and reassembling themselves. The doll turned to Mia, its glassy eyes blazing with unnatural light. Play with me, Mia, it demanded. Mia's fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she remembered her grandmother's advice. Do not let it feed on your fear. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped forward. I'm not afraid of you, Mia said, her voice steady. You don't control me. The doll let out a shriek, its porcelain face cracking again. The mirror began to glow, pulling the shadows and the doll toward it. Clara's spirit fought against the pull, her screams echoing through the room. Thank you, Clara's voice softened as her form dissolved into light. The doll crumbled into dust, and the mirror shattered, leaving the room in silence. Mia collapsed into her grandmother's arms, tears streaming down her face. Is it over? She whispered. Her grandmother nodded. It's over. The next morning, Mia felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. She and her grandmother buried the mirror shards and the doll's remains in a secret spot, ensuring the curse could never return. But as they walked away, Mia thought she heard a faint whisper carried on the wind. The Locked Basement, Episode 1, The First Knock. Emma had always considered herself a rational person. She worked as a science teacher, lived alone in her late grandmother's house, and rarely indulged in flights of fancy. The house, an old Victorian structure, creaked and groaned with age, but Emma dismissed the noises as natural. That was until the knocking started. It began on a Tuesday night. Emma was curled up on the couch, a cup of tea in hand and a novel open on her lap, when she heard it, a distinct, deliberate knock. It came from the basement door. Her first thought was that she had imagined it. Setting her book aside, she strained to listen. The house was quiet except for the occasional rustle of the wind outside. Dismissing the sound, she went to bed, but as she drifted off, the knock came again, 3 sharp raps, echoing through the silent house. The next morning, Emma approached the basement door with hesitation. She had never liked the basement. It was dark, damp, and filled with decades of her family's forgotten belongings. The door itself was an imposing wooden barrier, painted white but chipped and worn with age. The lock, a sturdy brass mechanism, seemed almost unnecessary given the weight of the door. Grasping the handle, Emma gave it a tentative turn. The door didn't budge. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Of course, it was locked. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had gone down there. She shook off her unease and went about her day. At school, she taught her classes and graded papers, but the memory of the knocking lingered in the back of her mind. By the time she returned home, the rational part of her brain had convinced her it was nothing, perhaps the wind or the old pipes. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it woke her from a deep sleep. She bolted upright, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was dark and still, but the sound was unmistakable, 3 deliberate knocks, coming from the basement door. Emma grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. Clutching it tightly, she made her way down the stairs, each creak of the steps amplifying her anxiety. Standing before the basement door, she hesitated. The rational part of her mind screamed that it was nothing, that opening the door would only confirm the emptiness beyond it. But her curiosity and unease won out. She reached for the key, which hung on a small hook beside the doorframe. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door and swung it open. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the dusty stairs and cobweb-covered walls. The air was cold and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth. Emma's light swept the room below, but as far as she could see, the basement was empty. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. Just as she turned to close the door, she heard it again, the knock. This time, it came from within the basement itself. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. Slowly, she turned the flashlight back toward the darkness below. The beam flickered, the light dimming for a moment before returning to full strength. She took a cautious step down, her eyes darting across the room. "Hello," she called, her voice shaking. The only response was the oppressive silence. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Emma retreated upstairs and locked the basement door behind her. She spent the rest of the night on the couch, the lights on and her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Sleep eluded her, every creak of the house setting her nerves on edge. By morning, she had convinced herself it was a trick of her imagination. But as she sipped her coffee and stared at the basement door, she couldn't help but feel that something was waiting for her down there. Something that wouldn't stay hidden for long. The Locked Basement, Episode 2, The Shadow Below. The following night, Emma's resolve began to waver. Despite her efforts to rationalize the strange events, she couldn't ignore the memory of the knock from within the basement. She spent the day at work distracted, her mind spinning through possibilities none of which offered any comfort. By the time she returned home, the house felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the faint creaks of the old structure felt more pronounced, as if the house itself was alive and aware of her presence. She avoided the basement door entirely, instead trying to distract herself with television and marking assignments. But the knocking came again. This time, it was louder and more insistent. Emma sat frozen on the couch, her heart pounding. The knocks reverberated through the quiet house, 3 sharp raps that seemed to vibrate in her chest. She grabbed her phone and considered calling the police, but what would she say? That her basement door was making noises, they'd think she was ridiculous. Instead, she steeled herself and walked toward the door. The hallway felt unnaturally long, each step taking an eternity. She stopped in front of the door, staring at its chipped paint and tarnished brass knob. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The only answer was silence. Determined to confront whatever was causing the disturbance, Emma retrieved the key and unlocked the door. This time, she grabbed a heavy flashlight and a kitchen knife before descending the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of damp earth became stronger. Her flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing the same forgotten furniture and boxes she had seen the night before. Then, she noticed something new. In the far corner of the basement, where the light barely reached, a shadow moved. It wasn't the flicker of her flashlight or a trick of her eyes. This shadow shifted with intent, slithering across the wall like liquid darkness. Emma's breath caught in her throat. "Who's there?" she demanded again, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow stopped, as if acknowledging her presence. Then, it began to grow, stretching upward until it resembled a towering, humanoid figure. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The shadow's form was indistinct, its edges shifting and blurring, but two pinpricks of pale light appeared where its eyes should have been. They stared at her, unblinking. "What do you want?" Emma managed to choke out. The figure didn't answer, but the basement seemed to vibrate with an unspoken tension. The boxes rattled, and the old furniture groaned as if under immense pressure. The figure raised an arm along, spindly appendage that pointed directly at her. Emma took a step back, her foot catching on the edge of a stair. She tumbled backward, landing hard on the steps. The flashlight flew from her hand, its beam spinning wildly before settling on the floor. When she looked back toward the corner, the shadow was gone. The basement was silent again, save for her ragged breathing. Emma scrambled back upstairs, slamming the basement door behind her. She locked it and shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Her hands shook as she dialed her friend Sophie, the only person she could think of who wouldn't dismiss her story outright. "Emma, it's late," Sophie answered grudgingly. "I need you to come over," Emma said, her voice frantic. "Something's in my house, please, Sophie." After a pause, Sophie sighed. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Emma hung up and sat on the couch, her eyes fixed on the basement door. The house was quiet now, but the oppressive feeling remained, as though the shadow's presence still lingered. She didn't move until Sophie arrived, bursting through the front door with a baseball bat in hand. "Okay, what's going on?" Sophie demanded, her eyes darting around the room. Emma explained everything: the knocks, the shadow, the uncheckable feeling of being watched. Sophie listened, her expression skeptical but concerned. "Look, I don't know what you saw," Sophie said finally, "but let's check it out together. Maybe it's just, I don't know, a raccoon or something." Reluctantly, Emma agreed. Armed with the baseball bat and flashlight, the two descended into the basement. But when they reached the bottom of the stairs, everything was as it had been before, dusty, cluttered, and still. "There's nothing here, Emma," Sophie said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Maybe you just need some sleep." Emma wanted to believe her, but as they turned to leave, she noticed something on the wall where the shadow had stood. A series of long, deep scratches marred the plaster, as though something with claws had tried to carve its way out. The Locked Basement, Episode 3, The Final Descent. Emma couldn't sleep. The scratches on the basement wall played over and over in her mind, each jagged line a testament to something unnatural. Even Sophie, who had tried to reassure her, left the house pale-faced and uneasy. For the next 2 days, Emma avoided the basement entirely. She locked the door and shoved furniture in front of it, but the knocking didn't stop. It came at all hours now, not just in the dead of night. Louder, more insistent, as if demanding her attention. And then, on the third day, it stopped. The silence was worse. On the fourth night, Emma woke to a different sound, the creak of a door slowly opening. Her heart sank as she realized it was coming from the basement. The door she had locked and barricaded was now ajar. Grabbing her flashlight and knife, Emma crept downstairs. The hallway was cold, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth. The basement door hung open, revealing the yawning darkness below. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she knew she couldn't live with the fear forever. Whatever was down there had to be confronted. She descended the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the same dusty boxes and forgotten furniture. But something was different. The air felt alive, vibrating with a low hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "I'm not afraid of you," Emma said, her voice trembling. It was a lie, and the basement seemed to know it. The hum grew louder, resolving into a chorus of whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping in a chaotic symphony of incomprehensible words. She swept the flashlight around the room, and then she saw it, the shadow. It was no longer confined to the corner. It sprawled across the floor and walls, shifting and writhing like a living thing. The pale pinpricks of light that served as its eyes fixed on her, unblinking. "Why are you here?" Emma demanded, gripping the knife tightly. The whispers intensified, forming a single, chilling word. "Stay!" Emma's blood ran cold. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils reaching for her. She stumbled back, swinging the flashlight wildly. The beam disrupted the shadow, causing it to recoil with an inhuman hiss. Summoning every ounce of courage, Emma shone the light directly at its center. The shadow writhed and shrank, retreating to the corner where it had first appeared. The whispers faded, replaced by a deafening silence, but Emma knew it wasn't over. She approached the corner cautiously, the flashlight trembling in her hand. On the floor, where the shadow had gathered, lay an object, a small, ornate key. Emma picked up the key, its cold metal sending a shiver through her. It was intricately designed, with strange symbols etched into its surface. Her gaze shifted to the far wall of the basement, where the scratches had appeared. Now, she noticed something else, a small, concealed door, barely large enough to crawl through. Heart pounding, Emma approached the door and inserted the key. The lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into utter darkness. The air that wafted out was colder than ice, carrying a smell of decay and earth. The whispers returned, faint and distant, beckoning her forward. Emma hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to close the door and leave. But she knew she couldn't. Whatever haunted her house, whatever had claimed her basement, was tied to this tunnel. If she wanted her life back, she had to face it. Taking a deep breath, Emma crawled into the tunnel. The walls were rough and damp, pressing close around her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, filling her head with fragmented words and half-formed sentences. She couldn't tell how long she crawled, minutes, hours, an eternity. Finally, the tunnel opened into a cavern. The flashlight's beam revealed walls covered in the same symbols as the key. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on it rested a black, pulsating orb. The shadow was there too, coiled around the orb like a guardian. Emma approached the pedestal, her knife in one hand and the flashlight in the other. The shadow reared up, its form towering and menacing, but it didn't attack. Instead, it spoke, its voice a guttural rumble that resonated in her bones. Release. Emma didn't understand, but she knew one thing: the orb was the source of everything. Gritting her teeth, she drove the knife into the orb. It shattered with a blinding flash of light, the shadow letting out a piercing scream as it dissolved into nothingness. When Emma opened her eyes, she was back in her basement. The air was still, the oppressive weight gone. The small door and the scratches on the wall had vanished, leaving only smooth plaster behind. She climbed the stairs and locked the basement door for the final time. Emma never heard the knocking again, but sometimes, late at night, she swore she could feel a pair of eyes watching her from the darkness. The Silent Scream, Episode 1, The Reflection. The antique mirror had been a whimsical find at a small roadside shop. Its ornate, gilded frame gleamed in the dim light, and the glass, though slightly cloudy, seemed to hold stories within its depths. Lena couldn't resist the allure, and for only $20, it was hers. The shopkeeper had said little during the transaction, only murmuring, "Don't look too long." She dismissed the warning as the eccentricity of an old man trying to add mystique to his wares. But as she drove home with the mirror secured in the back seat, a strange unease settled over her. The first night, Lena hung the mirror in her bedroom, opposite her bed. The reflection caught the soft glow of her bedside lamp, giving the room a cozy, if slightly surreal, atmosphere. Exhausted from a long day, she collapsed into bed and drifted off to sleep. At exactly 3 a.m., Lena woke abruptly. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Groggy and disoriented, her eyes were drawn to the mirror. The dim light from the street lamp outside illuminated its surface, and for a moment, she thought she saw something move within the glass, a shadow, fleeting and insubstantial. "It's just my imagination," she muttered, turning over and pulling the blanket over her head, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was watching her. Every time she passed by, she felt compelled to glance into it, only to find her own reflection staring back. Yet something felt off. The reflection seemed delayed, like a poorly synced video feed. That evening, as Lena brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she caught sight of something that made her freeze. Behind her, just over her shoulder, a figure stood. Its features were indistinct, blurred as though seen through fog glass, but its outline was unmistakably human. Heart pounding, she spun around. The room was empty. She turned back to the mirror, and the figure was gone. Her reflection stared back, wide-eyed and pale. Over the following days, the occurrences became more frequent. Lena started noticing faint whispers when she was alone in her room, soft and indistinct, like distant voices carried on the wind. Each night, she woke at exactly 3 a.m., the mirror always drawing her gaze. One night, she decided to test herself. Armed with her phone, she set up a video recording pointed directly at the mirror and went to bed. The next morning, she reviewed the footage. For the first few hours, nothing happened. Then, at 3 a.m., the mirror's surface seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a breeze. Slowly, a pale figure emerged in the reflection, its mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Its hands pressed against the glass, as though trying to break through. Lena's sleeping form was visible in the background, completely oblivious. The figure lingered for several minutes before fading back into the depths of the mirror. The recording ended shortly after. Lena stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The figure's face, if it could be called that, was etched into her mind. It was not just a random apparition. It was her own face, twisted in agony. She turned to the mirror, which stood innocently in the corner of her room. For the first time, she noticed faint smudges on the glass, as though hands had been pressed against it from the inside. Episode 2, The Whispering Glass. Lena couldn't bring herself to remove the mirror. She thought about smashing it, but something about the way it seemed to hum with energy kept her from acting. It was as though the mirror was alive, waiting. The following night, she moved it to her living room, away from her bedroom. Yet even with the door closed, Lena felt its presence, like a cold draft that seeped into her bones. Sleep came in fitful bursts, and when she finally succumbed, she was again jolted awake at 3 a.m. Determined to confront her fear, Lena walked to the living room. The air felt heavier with every step, and a faint, persistent sound reached her ears. A low whisper, rhythmic and eerie, as if the glass was speaking. When she turned on the light, the whispers stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. The mirror stood undisturbed, its surface gleaming in the dim glow of the overhead bulb. For a moment, she thought everything was normal until she noticed her reflection. It didn't move. Her reflection stared back, frozen in place, its eyes locked on hers. Lena lifted her hand, the reflection stayed still. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass, and finally, her reflection's mouth began to move. The words were soundless but clear. "Help me." Lena stumbled back, her heart racing. She blinked, and her reflection mirrored her again, as though nothing had happened. But she knew what she had seen. She grabbed her phone and dialed her best friend, Ellie. "Lena, it's the middle of the night," Ellie answered grudgingly. "I need you to come over," Lena said, her voice trembling. "It's the mirror. There's something wrong with it." There was a pause on the line before Ellie sighed. "Okay, give me 20 minutes. When Ellie arrived, Lena practically dragged her to the living room. "Just watch," Lena said, pointing at the mirror. Ellie stared at the reflection, her expression skeptical. "It's just a mirror, Lena." "Wait," Lena insisted, her eyes fixed on the glass. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. Frustrated, Lena stepped closer to the mirror. "Why won't you show her?" she demanded. The moment the words left her lips, the whispers returned, louder this time. Ellie froze, her face pale. "What is that?" she whispered. Before Lena could answer, the glass began to ripple like disturbed water. The reflection of the room twisted, warping unnaturally. A hand emerged from the surface, thin, pale, and claw-like. It reached toward Lena. Ellie screamed and pulled Lena back just as the hand touched her shoulder. The mirror's surface snapped back to normal, the whispers ceasing instantly. The two women stared at the glass, trembling. "We need to get rid of it," Ellie said, her voice firm. "Now." They carried the mirror outside, its weight seeming to increase with every step. By the time they reached the curb, Lena was gasping for air. They placed the mirror face down on the ground. "Smash it," Ellie urged, handing Lena a hammer. But as Lena raised it, she hesitated. The whispers returned, faint but pleading. "Don't," the voice begged. "Please." Lena lowered the hammer, her hands shaking. "It's asking for help," she said. "It's lying," Ellie snapped. "Destroy it, Lena." Before she could decide, the mirror's surface shimmered, and the reflection of Lena's face appeared, twisted in anguish. The silent scream returned, louder and more desperate. Lena dropped the hammer, unable to look away. Ellie grabbed her arm and pulled her back toward the house. "We're leaving it here," Ellie said. "Whatever it wants, we're not giving it the chance." The two women retreated inside, locking the doors and pulling the curtains. Outside, the mirror lay on the curb, its surface dark and silent. But as the night deepened, faint scratches appeared on the glass, as though something inside was trying to claw its way out. Episode 3, The Final Reflection. Lena and Ellie spent the rest of the night in the living room, too frightened to return to their bedrooms. The mirror remained on the curb, but its presence lingered in their minds like a heavy shadow. Every creak of the house made them jump, and the faintest sound felt like a whisper from the glass. By dawn, Ellie decided they needed help. There has to be someone who knows what to do, she said, scrolling through her phone. After a few minutes, she found a local historian who specialized in paranormal artifacts. His name was Dr. Adrian Harker. Later that morning, Dr. Harker arrived, his demeanor calm but curious. He listened intently as Lena recounted the events, his expression growing graver with each detail. When they brought him to the mirror, he paused, studying it with an intensity that made Lena's skin crawl. "This mirror is a vessel," he said finally. "It traps energy spirits, emotions, fragments of lives. Something or someone is trying to escape, but it's not clear whether they mean harm." Lena's voice was shaky. "What can we do?" Dr. Harker set his bag down and retrieved a small, intricate box engraved with symbols Lena didn't recognize. "We need to perform a sealing ritual. If the entity is malevolent, this will bind it permanently. But if it's a spirit in distress, it may find peace." As the sun began to set, Dr. Harker prepared the ritual in Lena's backyard. The mirror was placed upright, surrounded by a circle of salt and candles. He instructed Lena and Ellie to stand at opposite ends of the circle while he began to chant in a low, rhythmic voice. At first, nothing happened. Then, the mirror's surface began to ripple, the reflections inside distorting wildly. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices overlapping in desperate pleas and guttural growls. "Don't break the circle," Dr. Harker warned, his voice steady despite the chaos. The figure from Lena's video emerged again, its mouth wide in a silent scream. But this time, it wasn't alone. Dozens of hands pressed against the glass, their movements frantic. The surface seemed to bulge, as though whatever was inside was moments away from breaking free. "It's too strong," Ellie shouted, her voice trembling. Dr. Harker's chant grew louder, his tone commanding. The candles flared, their flames unnaturally high. The mirror began to crack, fine lines spreading across its surface. The whispers turned into a single, piercing shriek that seemed to emanate from within Lena's own mind. "Hold on," Dr. Harker yelled, tossing a handful of powder onto the mirror. The shriek cut off abruptly, and the mirror shattered, fragments scattering within the salt circle. The air grew still, heavy with an unnatural silence. Lena felt a weight lift from her chest, as though she could finally breathe again. Dr. Harker knelt by the shards, inspecting them carefully. "It's done," he said, his voice weary. "The entity is sealed. What happens now?" Lena asked. "The pieces will need to be buried in separate, sacred grounds," Dr. Harker explained. "It's the only way to ensure it stays contained." As Dr. Harker packed the shards into his box, Lena and Ellie exchanged a look of relief and exhaustion. The ordeal was over, but the memory of the mirrors, whispers, and the figure's silent scream would haunt them for a long time. Before leaving, Dr. Harker turned to Lena. "Be cautious with objects that seem to call to you. They often carry more than just history." Lena nodded, her gaze lingering on the empty space where the mirror had hung. She knew she'd never forget the price of her curiosity. As the trio departed, the house grew quiet. But in the shadows of the shattered shards, a faint whisper stirred, too soft for anyone to hear.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.